Okay.
3 of those for the people here so they can follow along.
Sounds good. Awesome.
Right.
All right, y'all are running.
We're running, we're live. All right. So thanks for coming. I'm Keith Alba. We were talking about the employee broker over at the West office of Keller and Golden. Also one of the partners and owners in my home team. Mega team out of that West office. We do over 100 units a year. Last year was just shy of 50 million for 1.4 in GCI. So it's nice. My previous life, I was in the regional office at Keller Williams and got introduced to contracts via the franchise document there. Franchise, the regional's job is franchise sales and support. So we were charged with finding new people to open up Keller Williams franchises, and then had to go through a contract that was about that thick on the pieces. And so that's where I kind of cut my teeth on the language, and then realized in getting into real estate and resale, I could definitely differentiate myself by having a phenomenal understanding of the intricacies of the contract. And so I work with Damian Cox via the Cox Education arm of his law firm, and this is our 2019 version of the contract class. We haven't finalized it, so you'll see some stuff in here, and there's going to be something that's going to be labeled advanced. That's going to be our advanced contracts class. We just kind of put everything in the contract together, and being short notice, I didn't have a chance to kind of trim things out. So we'll talk about just about everything in the contract to buy and sell today, and go into more depth and on advanced contracts once we get that out and running. So we'll start with this. What's the difference between property with a capital P and a lowercase p in property when you're talking legalese and contracts?
The capital probably refers to the property that this contract is written on.
Correct, yeah. So when you see a capitalized term within any legal contract, that's going to mean that it's a defined term. And a defined term means it can be found somewhere else within the body of that contract on what you're speaking at. So property is one of the examples that within our contract to buy and sell. So rather than having to write out 123 Main Street, Littleton, Colorado, and the zip code and all that kind of stuff, you can just do a shortcut of capital P property. And now all of a sudden everybody knows, hey, if I want to know exactly what we're talking about, I can reference back into the contract for that. Other terms that are going to be helpful for you in writing contracts and understanding them, capital B buyer, capital S seller, right? So buyer and seller agree to such and such when you're doing amend extends or inspection resolutions or something along those lines. Now you don't have to type out Miss Mary and Joe buyer, seller, Sally and Sue seller, all that kind of good stuff, right? It's all there. So buyer, seller, contract, property, all kinds of different pieces within the contract are going to be capitalized like that, and it's a little bit of a shortcut and can help distinguish you from other agents out there that don't understand that, hey, we're dealing with a legal contract, let's use legal terms and jargon.
So question,
Sure.
So what if you intend to do that, but you don't capitalize it? So the buyer and seller all agree to, but you don't capitalize what?
So I guess it's probably not going to be an issue until it becomes one, right? Everything's good until it's not, right? And that brings up the point of, who wins in cases of ambiguity? Attorneys. And that's kind of our job, and that's the way I look at it when I'm drafting these things, is I'm hired to remove as much ambiguity as possible within the contracts, within the documents, just so that everybody, if possible, can avoid having to lawyer up. We're clear with what the terms of this agreement are, and we're going to be moving forward. And so lowercase b and lowercase s in the provision, probably not going to be an issue unless the parties got sideways with something else, and now all of a sudden they want to start tearing apart the contract and bringing stuff into question. So things like intent would get argued and stuff along those lines. So and we're just going to kind of roll right through the contract. So section 1 is the agreement. Capital B buyer agrees to buy, and capital S seller agrees to sell capital P property described below in the terms and conditions. And here we've got the defined term contract, right? As set forth in this contract, and then by the parentheses and a capital C contract after that, now all of a sudden we've got a new defined term. That's what this is talking about. When we're looking for contract, it's this agreement between buyer and seller, and so now we can just use contract to reference that. Notice here, who is it between? Buyer and seller, right? We are not a party to the contract as real estate agents. If you'll notice when we get later on in the section, the broker acknowledgements, right above the broker acknowledgements, right below the signatures, it says end of contract, right? So there's just an additional disclosure in that bottom part that's there, but we are not a part of the contract. That's why the commission says we can't involve our commissions as a part of it unless it's to the benefit of one of the parties that's a part of it, right? So if your exclusive right to buy listing contract states the buyer is going to agree to get, you're getting 2.8% or whatever commission you agree to within that contract, and the buyer is obligated, and they so instruct you, now you can add something in the additional provisions that says, hey, on behalf of capital B buyer, capital S seller is agreeing to pay a commission equal to whatever that number was in your exclusive right to buy, because it benefits the buyer. If the exclusive right to buy states that the buyer is not obligated, now all of a sudden you're stuck. You're accepting what they're offering in the MLS, and your commissions cannot get entered into the contract because it is to your benefit, not to one of the parties. Make sense? Huh? All right, so the parties, here's where we're defining who is the buyer. This is where the names are going to go in, right? Who is the seller? How are they taking title? Joint tenants or tenants in common if there are multiple buyers in there, and what's the difference?
Are you asking?
Yeah, what's the difference between joint tenancy and tenants in common?
Half and half, one's half and half, and the other one could be different percentages for each.
Yeah, one is implies a 50-50 ownership, and there's rights of survivorship as a part of the joint tenancy. So in a joint tenancy, if something happens to the other party that is part of that joint tenancy, the ownership automatically transfers over to the remaining party. There's not any need for probate or something along those lines. Whereas tenants in common, you're going to specify what that ownership is. It may be 50-50 as well, but now all of a sudden, let's say it's not a married couple or they're not married at all, they just decided to buy the house together. Now, you could sell half of the house, technically. You could go out there and market 50% ownership in this property if you could find somebody that wants to buy in with a stranger that they don't know and have all that fun stuff. So it's possible, it's not very common, but with tenants in common, you can sell a portion of an interest in the property. So, a couple years back, or actually the beginning of this year, no assignability, right? This contract, as it states here in 2.2, is not assignable. So unless there's other verbiage that's added into this contract to buy and sell, you know who the buyer is going to be, the sellers know who's going to be the buyer, and you can do your due diligence on something along those lines. If you do get a contract that has some assignability language in there, I'd encourage you to make sure it's limited, right? Not just a blanket assignability that, hey, I can assign this to anybody and everybody that's out there. Maybe it's just assigning it to an entity that's wholly owned by this buyer, or that the seller has the right to approve the next buyer that's going on. Because while you're doing the due diligence on this buyer, you talk to the lender, hey, yeah, they got great credit, they've submitted all their documentation, they're good to go, but they're going to assign it to somebody else. How do we know what that other buyer's qualifications look like if we don't have some reasons or ability to vet that new assigned buyer? We could have the market off that property off the market for 30 plus days or longer, only to find out that this new buyer can't qualify and they just tied up. Property, within Colorado, the property is transferred via the legal description, not your also known as street address, right? So this property legal description is going to be vital in regards to making sure that it's accurate. Things you don't want to put in there, number one, to be filled out by the title company, right? They don't have the real estate license, we do, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing the work to do it. Know that public records is not great. They're not always accurate. In a pinch, if that's the only thing you can get to, then use that, but know that it may be inaccurate. My recommendation is go to the vesting deed. How was the title transferred previously to the current owner? If you can pull up that past deed, whether it's a warranty, a special warranty, or general warranty, or something along those lines, it's going to have the legal description within that deed. You can pull it straight from there and bring it over.
How would you get that?
So Sorry, I get some comments saying, hi, Cheryl. And yeah, Cheryl, just on the contract to buy and sell. How do I get to the vesting deed? For me, my process when I'm going out on a listing appointment, when I set that appointment, one of the first things I do is I order an O&E from the title company. O&E is an ownership and encumbrance. So it's going to show, what liens are against the property. And within that, at least I know First American does this, they will have a link to that vesting deed. That's a part of it. So you can just click on that. It'll pull up what's in public records that was recorded, and you can pull it straight out of that document. Those are $5, I think, to get those things ordered. And I tell you, it's great because once a seller enters into this contract, there's very little opportunity for them to get out, right? They're pretty much stuck in selling this thing unless a small handful of things come up. And I've had situations, luckily we were on the buy side of the transaction, where we're moving along, we're going through the process, a couple of weeks in, and all of a sudden a lien pops up, or the title commitment comes over and says, hey, you're gonna have to pay off all these liens, Mr. Seller. And they're like, oh, hey, I forgot about that judgment that's there, never mind, just kidding, I don't want to sell anymore. It's like, no, you don't have the right to do that anymore. You're selling it regardless of this, and you're just not gonna get the proceeds. They definitely weren't happy in that situation, which is why I always check to make sure that my sellers are aware of at least what's on record of the liens against them. So legal description is definitely important, and then just type in also known as the street address on that side. Okay. Inclusions. Couple of big potential gotchas on this one. So inclusions, if attached to the property on the date of the contract, the following items are included unless excluded under exclusions. Lighting, heating, plumbing, ventilating, air conditioning units, TV antennas, inside telephone, network, coax, cable wiring, connecting blocks, plants, mirrors, floor coverings, intercom systems, built-in kitchen appliances, sprinkler systems and controls built in, so on and so forth, right? So notice it says built in here, right? I always talk to my clients about attached. Hey, if you need a tool to get it off, right, then that's going to be technically considered attached, whether or not it's, included in this thing or not. So that's my rule of thumb, right? But what about the kitchen fridge? Is that a built-in appliance? Is it attached? I don't know. What about the water line? The what? Water line. You need a tool to undo the water line for the ice maker, right? So could it be? So that's just kind of some of the ambiguity that I'm talking about, right? So when I'm going through these sorts of things, I don't necessarily put in washer, dishwasher, oven, cooktop, those sorts of things, because I think that pretty easily falls underneath those built-in appliances. But I'll put in something like kitchen fridge as shown in the MLS photos, right? Because I've had people that have just put in refrigerator, and all of a sudden the 1970s one from the basement moves up, they put that into the hole in the kitchen and take the nice one and move out, right? So did they fulfill the terms of the contract? Did they not? Again, that's one of those things you got to get in front of a person in a long flowing black robe that we refer to as your honor to make the decision. So I want to have something in there that says, if it says kitchen fridge as demonstrated, I make sure I have an MLS printout, it's got the photos, and I can say this is the refrigerator in question, not the one that you guys have left us for. Right? So I got the photos. If checked, the following are owned by the seller and included, right? So nothing, solar panels, water softener, security system, satellites. Solar panels are a huge thing that have come up multiple times, both on my team and within my office, and I hear are major issues. In this section, it's got to be owned, meaning the seller has bought those solar panels. It's not a lease, right? They don't own them in a lease situation. This is just if it's an owned situation. They paid for them outright, they got a loan, paid off of that loan, or something along those lines. That's where this box is going to be checked. If it's a lease situation, you're going to have to add some additional verbiage and the additional provisions requiring the buyer to assume that lease, to go through a qualification period. What does that look like? All of those sorts of fun things. So note there that's potential pitfall. Water softeners may be the same deal, right? Sometimes there are leased or rented water softeners, water purification pieces. So we need to make sure we have clarity, especially if we're on the listing side, on those features. Are they owned or are they leased? How is that going to work? Because this could be accepted, right? If it's owned, then all of a sudden the seller may be having to pay for the buyout of that lease for the buyer in order to perform to the terms of this. You're going to have a happy seller if that's a cost that they weren't expecting. There's another potential gotcha, 2.5.2, inclusions not attached. If on the property, whether attached or not. So if any of these items are just there on the property, they are conveying unless specifically excluded. Storm windows, storm doors, window and porch shades, awning, blinds, screens, window covering treatments, curtain rods, drapery rods, fireplace inserts, fireplace screens, fireplace grates, heating stoves, storage sheds, carbon monoxide alarms, smoke detectors, and all keys automatically transfer out, right? So just make sure that seller is good with that. If they're not, either you got to make sure it's excluded, or just tell them to take it off of the property. Just remove it. Take it somewhere else. Take it to a storage unit. Take it to a friend's house. Take it to the neighbors. We don't care. Just get it gone. But it says if on the property. So if it's there, it's being conveyed. Personal property conveyance. Any personal property must be conveyed at closing by seller, free and clear of all taxes, except for personal property tax as the year of the closing. Liens and encumbrances except. So here, if you have a solar panel, seller has bought, but they took out a loan in order to do so, and the buyer is going to be taking it over, that would be what that line is for, right? Except for the loan against the solar panels. We need to disclose that, make sure it's part of that, okay? Conveyance of all personal property will be a bill of sale, and then the other inclusions, what else is going along with it. My suggestion is always to talk to the loan officer in this section, right? Smaller things, kitchen refrigerator, maybe a couple of chairs or something along those lines, they're not going to have too much worry about. When you start getting into higher ticket items like hot tub, pool tables, things along those lines, all of a sudden the lenders start getting a little bit worried because now some of the stuff that is securing the loan, so some of the collateral that this lender is lending against can be sold, can be moved off, can go, in the event that the lender has to come back and take over this property back over via foreclosure or something, they want to know that the collateral is going to be there, right? And so they'll come back and they'll say, hey, take out that stuff out of the other inclusions. We can't have it as a part of the loan package, right? And so now we're in a difficult situation representing our buyers. What do? Right? They wanted that hot tub and that pool table, and they're paying a price for it as a part of the purchase price, but the lender's saying take it out. What the lenders were telling us before is, hey, put it on a bill of sale, transfer it for $1. Problem there is it really worth $1? Is it really worth $1? Is that fair market value of a hot tub and a pool table? If you were to sell that at a garage sale tomorrow, would you only put $1 value on those? Probably not. So why are you putting it as $1 here? Well, because I was told to by the lender. Well, is that loan fraud? Possibly, right? We're possibly getting into sections there. The other thing is, okay, let's say I'm the seller. I sign a bill of sale. They can give me $1 for this thing, and all of a sudden, as a buyer's agent, you terminate, right? What's to prevent that buyer from showing up tomorrow with that bill of sale and a crisp, clean dollar bill and saying, hey, I'm here for my pool table and my hot tub, here's your $1. They have conveyed that property via bill of sale saying, hey, it's yours now, right? So these were some of the issues that were coming up. And so the commission came out with a new contract or new agreement that is called the Personal Property Agreement, PPA. For some of the things that the lender's going to have heartburn over, we can enter into this Personal Property Agreement, put those items on there. They come up with a fair market value, $2,500 for that pool table and the hot tub. Maybe we reduce the price by that amount or something along those lines. Because this is so new, I have a feeling that we have the ability to kind of play with the lenders a little bit here. And what I'm telling my agents and my brokers to do is put the house, say you were going to offer $500,000 for that price, right? And you have $2,500 worth of personal property that you're going to put onto this agreement. Write it at $500,000. Put seller concessions of $2,500. And then write up your personal property agreement at $2,500 for the pool table and the hot tub, right? Now all of a sudden the buyer's closing costs are reduced by $2,500. They're bringing $2,500 for the pool table and hot tub, but the net to them is kind of a wash. You following that? I don't think that lenders are gonna have too much issues with that, but we gotta do it up front, right? We gotta do it on the first contract. If we start trying to slip that in later, oh, hey, purchase price is gonna be reduced by $500, they're gonna go up to $2,500 in seller concessions, and here's this property agreement, that makes me some red flags with the underwriting. Okay? Have any questions in here? We're still good
So
on
if
that?
the seller wanted to sell it for $500,000
Yes.
and you're offering a $2,500 seller concession. So the
Well, it's
buyer,
only in the event that you think that there's too much personal property that's gonna be a part of it. Yeah.
and so then the buyer's really getting it for,
497.5 is kind of the net to the seller, but seller's not getting $2,500 via the sale of that personal property, which would bring it back up to that $500,000 sales price. Because that's outside of your typical closing costs and things that would be on the buyer's settlement statement. But they're, via that personal property agreement, agreeing to bring that additional money to the closing table where they're gonna purchase that hot tub.
so you wouldn't do the purchase price at $500 and $2,500. Because if they're,
Oh. So you're saying in the event that
what if they,
you push it up by,
they really want to get $500,000, so in that
the
case.
seller wants the
seller
net
wants
500,000.
but they're gonna throw these things in, and contract comes in, and, but I'm just
They're
wondering.
gonna throw it in as in there's no value to the seller?
They wanna get $500,000, so if you.
So they're still getting 500,000, by the way, I talked to you about it, right? Because 500,000 less $2,500 in seller concessions, that net sales price is the 497.5.
Right,
But then they're getting $2,500 through the sale of this personal property that they were willing to throw in before.
oh.
So that
they're
would bring
giving
it back
them a
up
check,
to,
So how are they getting that?
But they're getting a check.
buyer would bring that money to the closing table.
Oh.
The personal property
Personal
agreement
checks
and the contract to buy and sell live and die together. Yeah, so it's all conveyed at the time of closing via a bill of sale, right? And so it's an additional monies that the buyer would have to bring to purchase that personal property.
Check for $2,500.
They're getting another, yeah, so the sale would be recorded as 500,000 with $2,500 of seller concessions, but then the seller's getting $2,500 from the sale of the personal
Right,
property.
okay, got it.
Now, to your point, Jackie, what could be done is if the buyer doesn't care, right? If they're not really concerned whether or not the personal property is going to be there, then just write it at 500,000, and as a convenience to seller, buyer's agreeing to allow seller to leave personal property on the property, right? So they could leave it there, and the seller's like, hey, I don't care, I don't want this stuff, I'm gonna leave it with the property anyway. But the potential downside there is they change their mind, or they sell it, or a neighbor comes over and says, hey, I'll give you $500 for that. They're no longer contractually obligated to leave those things. Whereas the personal property agreements, they're bound to sell it for that amount that's included. Okay?
Okay.
Exclusions, pretty self-explanatory. These are the things that are going to be excluded from the sale. As I mentioned, make sure you're having conversations with your sellers beforehand so you get clarity on those things. I always, as I'm doing my listing consultations with them, I'm walking around, I'm asking them, is there anything in this property that has huge sentimental value to you as a family heirloom, something that is going to be a deal breaker if the buyer says, I want it? And if they say yes, again, my advice to them is just get it out of here. Just remove it completely. If it's a light fixture, replace it with the light fixture you're going to leave. If it's, a mirror or something along those lines, if the buyer doesn't know about it, they can't ask for it, right? And what I don't want to do is get into the situation where a seller and buyer are digging their heels in over something ridiculous. I had a contract one time, it was cash, almost $700,000 up north. Buyer wanted these drapes that were a part of it. We were negotiating back and forth, buyer saying that their drapes aren't included, I'm not going to do it. Seller, the wife digs her heels in and says, no, absolutely not, I'm not going to do it. I'm like, all right, well, you're going to walk away from this cash deal because they're saying that they're not going to do it if it's. She's like, you know what, fine, forget it. She's like, the bottom of it all frayed anyway, I've run over it so many times with the vacuum cleaner. She's like, it really doesn't matter. And I'm like, oh, God, let's kill this thing, right? why didn't you tell me this before, right? But yeah, it's crazy. So having that conversation as many times as possible is only going to reinforce the situation with the sellers. Water rights. This is going to be part of the advanced contracts where we get into it. If you are dealing with a property that has water rights, the best thing to do is to consult your client into getting an attorney. Right? Water rights are a commodity in Colorado. The value of it just keeps going up and up because we've sold off so much water rights downstream to the other states that are below us on that sort of thing, that it is becoming very contentious in regards to water rights. How's it going to transfer? How do we know what the value of the water rights are? Is it ditch rights? Is it use rights? Is it irrigation rights? There's just so much difference that's out of it that I'd stay away from it in terms of me consulting on it. Buyer, seller, you need to hire an attorney. I'm happy to take any information that they put and drop into the contract to buy and sell, but that is out of my realm of expertise, and I'm not going to get involved in helping you with any of that. Okay. Okay, dates and deadlines. This is going to be kind of personal preference on stuff. For me personally, when I was first started, writing contract, I used First American's guide on the dates and deadlines piece. Damien Cox worked with First American and kind of gave you a guideline that's out there. And I can send you a copy of the one that's there so you can send it out to the people on Facebook Live and whatever. But it's just a great thing to kind of help you go through it. As you're looking at things, you know, when you want to do a record title, off-record title, all of that sort of stuff, it lays it out pretty easily. I will tell you right now, if you don't use alternative earnest money deadline and put some date in there or some MEC plus on that, the requirement here is that you deliver earnest money with the contract if you're not using alternative earnest money deadline. With CTM and .loop and the electronic software systems that we have now, I don't know how that's possible, and so I'm always putting some sort of alternative earnest money deadline. For me, it's MEC plus, because typically, you know, let's say I'm writing a contract today, I put, let's say, a hard date of Friday in there. But then we go to counter, we're negotiating, we're back and forth, and all of a sudden we don't accept the contract or accept the contract until Saturday. My buyer's already in default if I put a hard deadline in there. Where if I put MEC plus, now all of a sudden my client's got some opportunities in a few days. My personal preference is MEC plus 3. I figure within 3 days after going under contract, the client should be able to get a check over to the title company or whomever's holding the earnest money. Okay, so that's dates and deadlines. Applicability of terms. This could be another potential gotcha area, something to pay attention to. Any box checked in this contract means a corresponding provision applies. If any deadline blank in the dates and deadlines is left blank or completed with the abbreviation NA or the word deleted, such deadline is not applicable and the corresponding provision containing the deadline is deleted. So, you're going through, you're using CTM software, you say, you know what, let me think about when I want to put the title resolution deadline in, but I'm just going to go ahead and save my work now. What does CTM do to this blank? It drops an NA in there automatically, right? So this applicability of terms now states if NA is in my dates and deadlines, that deadline doesn't apply and that whole provision of the contract is gone. So unless I go back and put something in there, all of a sudden that provision for title resolution is no longer a part of the contract. And it could cause some major issues down the line, right? Say there's an issue on the title, they submitted a title objection, but oh, we don't have a title resolution because we deleted that provision on accident. That could cause some serious. The other thing with CTM is it can go through and it has 2 lines in there, doesn't it? One with the actual date and one where there's like places below. Well, the NA fills in below, right? So then maybe you go back and say, you know what, I need to have a title resolution deadline. So you put a date in the top, but you still have NA in below. Which rules? Is it deleted? Is it not applicable? Or is the data applicable? It's that ambiguity, right? It's that gray area where all of a sudden the parties are going to each have to lawyer up, fight it out in court, and figure out what the judge rules.
That's why it's recommended if you do have something in here that you put not applicable, like spell that out, and that means
It would say it's not applicable for that time, but it would preserve the provision within the contract, right? So you could easily go back and add it in. Yeah. Before the changes at the beginning of this year, this provision actually read that if any was in any of the contract, it deleted that whole provision of the piece. Now it's just in the deadlines. So if there's an NA or deleted in the dates and deadlines section, or left blank, NA or deleted, just in that dates and deadlines section, then the corresponding provisions. So it's a little bit better in that sense. Here we have the definition of MEC. MEC is defined as the mutual execution of this contract, which means the date upon which. That is the only defined term currently within our contract to buy and sell. If you've looked at Damian Cox's clauses and the backup clauses specifically, he's got an abbreviation TFC in there, the termination of first contract. But within that provision, he's defined what TFC means. So now all of a sudden in our dates and deadlines, we can add TFC plus certain days, right? Back in the 07, 08, 09 timeframes, SSA was a big popular one, and that was short sale approval deadline. But again, that had to be approved or defined within the additional provisions to say, hey, this is what SSA means, so all parties have an understanding of what it is. Okay? Purchase price in the terms section here. The biggest thing to remember on this piece is these bottom totals here must match. Right? Those two numbers in the amount sections on both of those pieces must be the same numbers that's there. Right? So purchase price 500,000, earnest money 5,000. What's the new loan amount? And then the difference between that is going to be cash and closing. These all should match, right? These three pieces that's there. Is there an opportunity for cash at closing to be a negative? Say yes.
Yes.
Yes. If it's a VA buyer, right? VA buyers can have 100% financing. So in the 500,000, they put $5,000 down as earnest money. The new loan amount is going to be 500,000, which if you total that up, 500 plus 500,000, that would be 505, which doesn't equal these things out, right? So that's why there would be a negative 5,000. They get their earnest money back at the closing in regards to that piece. Okay. Seller concessions in 4.2. This is an important one and one to pay attention to, right? A lot of people I see will use closing costs or buyer's closing costs and prepaids or something along those lines. It's a pretty standard, but it's old school, right? Look at this definition of seller concessions. At closing, seller would credit to buyer blank seller concessions. The seller concession may be used for any buyer fee, cost, charge, or expenditure to the extent the amount is allowed by buyer's lender and is included on the closing statements. So is there an opportunity to fit something else in there besides just closing costs and prepaids, so long as the buyer or the buyer's lender approves it? Yeah, for sure. So I've gotten big seller concessions amount here. We covered all the buyer's closing costs and prepaids and we had money left over. So I went to the lender and I said, okay, what other things can we use this money from the seller on behalf of my buyer? I've gotten like home warranties could go in there. Prepaid HOAs, like, hey, let's prepay a year's worth of HOAs out of the seller concessions money. All of those things are allowable in certain cases, but we just got to run it through the lender, right? But if you use closing costs and prepaids, you may be leaving money on the table that you've negotiated on behalf of your buyer, and they're not going to be so excited about leaving money or the seller's going to net more, right? The seller's going to be happy about it because, hey, we gave them $5,000, but they only used $2,500 or $3,000 of it. Goes back to them. If you're using closing costs and prepaids, they'd have the right to do that. Whereas if you're using seller concession, all of a sudden now you can, it broadens the thing. So long as the lender says it's okay and it shows up in the settlement statements, we're golden. We can use those funds. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind here is I use this a lot in negotiating on inspection pieces, right? Hey, rather than doing these repairs, seller's going to give you $2,500 at closing. But I'll write it up as a seller concession, right? Again, broad, open, allow me to use it on behalf of the buyer where I want to use it rather than just closing costs and prepayments. I guess real quick, since I mentioned the inspection pieces, I'll touch on it. If I'm using seller concessions in lieu of inspection items, what I won't do is put seller to provide buyer $2,500 in seller concessions on an inspection resolution. Why?
Because the lender gets that, or?
Lender gets it, absolutely. And the underwriter looks at it and it says, wait a minute. What's wrong with our collateral that the seller is giving up $2,500? And now all of a sudden they say, you know what? I want to see a copy of your inspection report.
So you just do an amend extend?
I do an amend extend. Do an amend extend, I send over the amend extend. Once it's fully executed, now I have to go back and make sure that the buyer withdraws their inspection objection. Because the amend extend is not considered an inspection resolution, right? We got another document for that. The contract states that if resolution isn't met by the resolution deadline, contract automatically terminates, right? So, hey, buyer, we're going to give you this concession rather than doing inspection resolution items. Here's your amend extend. Perfect. Now that that's signed, we need you to withdraw your inspection objection prior to the resolution deadline so the contract can move forward.
So I've had lenders say it was okay to, in the inspection resolution, to just say blank, like a blank statement of seller to provide buyer credit at closing, and not like reference because of inspection. And
Yeah.
that's fine for them. But,
Sometimes it is. I talk to the lender, to go down that path.
right.
I think it depends on the dollar amount that you're putting in there. But if it's on the inspection resolution form, if it reaches that threshold where the underwriter's hair, raises on the back of their neck, they may ask for this full inspection report, and that's a nightmare. Yeah. They're going to start saying, well, wait, there's this issue, and then renegotiate all the inspection. Maybe you're past your objection by that point, and everything starts blowing up from there. What's up, Mr. Humphreys? So, yeah. Earnest money. So, earnest money is set forth in the section in the form of how's it going to be delivered? I usually write personal check because that's the best way or the easiest way for my buyers to deliver earnest money is just via personal check. There's plenty of time typically in our closings for it to clear, turn into good funds so that the title company has the actual money that's going to be held by, who's going to be holding the earnest money. That's clearly spelled out there, so just agree upon those pieces. Alternative earnest money deadline, we talked about that. And the return of earnest money, here's a good one. If buyer has the right to terminate and timely terminates. So what does that mean?
Within the deadline.
Yeah, it's within the deadlines that were agreed upon within the, up above. It says, hey, buyer, you have the right. And they do so within that timeline, then they've timely terminated. Buyer is entitled to the return of the earnest money as provided in this contract. This contract is terminated as set forth in 25, and except as provided in section 24. The earnest money has not already been returned following receipt of notice to terminate. Seller agrees to execute and return to buyer or broker working with buyer written mutual instructions as in the form of the earnest money release within 3 days of seller's receipt. So I've had to point that out to a few sellers sometimes. They're upset that my buyer terminated and saying, you know what, I'm going to hold on to your earnest money just to get my pound of flesh back for you tying up my property and this, that, and the other. I'm like, okay, great. 3 days go by and I say, hey, by the way, Mr. Listing Agent, make sure you tell your sellers that they're in violation of the contract because they agreed to return this within 3 days. So they're either going to dispute the fact that we had the right to terminate according to this contract, or they need to sign my earnest money release. They're disputing it. Let's get the demand for mediation going, get that clock started, and get this thing rolling. When I start talking terms of the contract, mediation as required, those sorts of things, it's amazing how quickly the seller says, no, I don't want to deal with all of that stuff. I'm going to sign it, get out. Plus, they've had a few days to sleep on it. All of a sudden, their anchor level starts dropping a little bit. I've had to point this out to some of my sellers in certain cases as well, because they've been on the other side of that coin. Say, I get it. And do you think you have a right to challenge the earnest money? Do they not have a right to terminate? We can go down that path, but here's what the next steps of that is going to look like. Or we can just terminate this thing, move on, and get going. Right? One of the challenges I would say here is, say you're the listing agent. Buyer sends over a notice to terminate and an earnest money release. Seller says no. I'm not releasing that. You didn't have the right to terminate. But listing agent, I want you to put the house back on the property or back on the market. It's a dangerous situation, right? Because if the seller's saying, hey, I'm not releasing your earnest money, you didn't have the right to terminate this contract, what are they also saying?
Still
You're still in contract.
The contract is in full force and effect, right? He's just saying, hey, no, you didn't have the right to terminate, so I'm not releasing your earnest money. We're moving forward, right? When is like the final day where a buyer can't clear a default, can't correct it? After closing, right? They missed closing, now all of a sudden that's a hard default, they haven't changed it. But if the seller says, hey, you know what, I'm not really returning your earnest money, we go back to the buyer's agent and you say, you know what, we're challenging this, you didn't think you have the right to terminate. And they say all of a sudden, yeah, you're right, just kidding, we're back in contract, but they've gone on and accepted another contract. Now we've got a challenge, right? Seller has agreed to sell the house twice, but there's only one house. So it's problematic.
I do have a question on that, sorry.
Sure.
The earnest money, is there any reason why you'd want to have certified check?
Certified funds?
Yeah.
Only if it was a cash transaction, and the timeline of that is pretty small. Right? Because, again, if you're doing your standard closing 30 to 45 days, the earnest money is delivered within 3 days of contract. Title is going to deposit that, and we're going to find out whether or not there's good funds or sufficient funds to cover that in pretty short order. And by the time it gets to the closing date, then we're going to definitely know whether or not those funds have cleared. So I don't know. For me, I'm okay with them delivering a personal check and letting it kind of just clear that way as a listing agent. As a buyer's agent, I think it's more convenient for the buyers just to be able to write a check rather than having to go to the bank, pull a cashier's check, maybe pay a fee in order to get that cashier's check issued, and then take that over to the title company. So unless they're specifically requesting it and not allowing us to do something different than that, I put personal check as one of the other things to keep in mind here too is the promises to buy and sell and the warranties and representations that are contained within this whole contract are considered value in the state of Colorado. So everyone says that you have to have some sort of consideration or value as a part of a contract to make it legal and binding. This earnest money doesn't make it so. Everything else that's a part of this contract to buy and sell is the consideration and adds the value to it. So even with zero earnest money, this is a legal and binding contract. Good funds just defines what good funds is and when the time is payable, right? So any amounts payable by the parties at closing, including any loan proceeds, cash at closing, and closing costs must be in forms that comply with all applicable Colorado laws, including electronic transfer funds or wired, certified check, cashier's check, seller's obtaining checks, cashier, all of that is considered the good funds. Time of payment, all funds including the purchase price to be paid by buyer must be paid before or at closing or as otherwise agreed in writing between the parties to allow disbursement by the closing company. Or if such non-paying party will be in default. So buyer doesn't deliver earnest money, they're in default of the contract. We'll talk about what that means later on. Buyer represents that as the date of this contract that does or does not have the funds that are immediately verifiable and available in amount not less than the amount stated at cash and closing. So what does that mean? My cash at closing is $200,000, and I deliver a contract that says the buyer does have that funds that are immediately verifiable. Can I say, hey, once we sell this house, then I'll have those funds? It's not immediately verifiable, right? It's got to be a bank account, investment account. It's got to be something along those lines that it's a liquid form of that $200,000 of cash at closing. Otherwise, it could be considered setting your client up for a bad faith claim. Hey, you gave me something that said they did have the money. All of a sudden, we get to closing, they don't have the money. You enticed me into accepting this contract. Just problems. Okay, so new loan, buyer to pay loan costs. Except as permitted in 4.2, the seller concessions, buyer must finally pay loan costs, loan discount, twice prepaid item. So anything associated with the loan, unless there's a concession that's going on or something else that's written into the contract, that's going to be buyer's costs. Buyer may select financing, right? So what type of financing are they going to go? Conventional, FHA, VA, bond, or other. If a buyer is not sure whether or not they're going to be able to qualify for conventional, so they have a backup FHA, how do you complete your contract here in this section? What do you check? Both. I check both. If you check conventional and then all of a sudden it turns into an FHA deal down the road, and then there's lender requirements that come back as part of that FHA appraisal, again, you're getting into a potential bad faith claim where the seller's going to say, hey, listen, you told me this was a conventional loan. Now you're telling me that there's requirements that I have to change or make to the property in order for you to get your FHA financing. Again, it could be you enticed me to accept your contract based off of false information, which is a bad faith claim and a violation later on.
I mean, I see this all the time.
Oh, I do too.
Like they'll put conventional, and then maybe they really were at the time, but then that buyer, maybe I have a listing, so the buyer changes to an FHA, and I never know about it until I get an FHA appraiser there. And I'm like, there's been times I've had two contracts, one's a conventional, one's an FHA, and then the seller chooses the conventional, it turns into it,
Right.
I see this all.
I agree. It happens all the time. And there's a lot of stuff out there that when you start getting into the contract and really learning it intimately, things that agents do out there are so contradictory to what the contract actually states and what the parties are agreeing to. I think that's why we're starting to see the complaints on the rise at the Real Estate Commission, the fines, the things along those lines. Is that people are going with more of what the industry norms are or what has been done previously versus doing it the right way.
I mean, I had one, they clicked FHA, but on the purchase, it was a cash at closing, the earnest money, and the balance was cash at closing, but they clicked FHA. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, what is this?
Yeah, sloppy, there's been a lot of agents that have been attracted to this market. And so last I saw, there's 46,000 some odd agents that are licensed in the state of Colorado right now. And so there's, as I tell my clients all the time, all agents are created equal. Assumption, we're not going to touch too much on this, but this is in the event that your seller has a loan that is able to be assumed by the next party that's out there. That's when this section would apply, right? It's going to talk about transfer fees, what the interest rates are, all of those sorts of pieces. Buyer's still going to have to qualify through the seller's lender. They'll be transferred over to them at the end. Seller financing, again, is another advanced topic, but in the event that the seller is doing the financing or doing an owner carry for the second, all that sort of pieces, that'll be in the advanced contracts. One of the things to be cautious of here is if there is some sort of a seller financing, seller's doing a second, we are prevented from entering any of the terms of that into our contract to buy and sell. Seller's agreeing to provide a second loan for 30 years at an interest rate of 4.5%, fully amortizing, so on and so forth. The reason there is the Real Estate Commission looks at that as originating a loan. And if we're going to be originating a loan, we have to have an MLO, a mortgage loan originator's license, that's a part of it. So we could put something in here, and there's dates and deadlines that are a part of it. Hey, here's the terms of when the seller financing terms need to be delivered to buyer. Buyer has the right to review by this time and object by this time. We can do that to protect the buyer, but we can't start negotiating any of the terms of that seller financing as a part of the contract unless you have a mortgage loan originator's license. 4.7 just continues on in regards to the pieces. Okay, financing conditions. It's a little bit of a gray area in regards to the piece. So what is considered a loan application? A lot of people I see, when you're talking about loan application and dates and deadlines, they've got a pre-approval, pre-qualified letter, they're saying completed in the dates and deadlines section, right? Well, I get that, and that's kind of what we've adapted to and accepted. But if we look at the true definition according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, they say a loan application happens when there's an executed ratified contract that's a part of it. So if you're writing a contract and it hasn't been accepted by the seller, how do you have a true loan application if the contract hasn't been accepted yet, right? So in something along those lines, just for me, I put in process or submitted or something along those lines to say, hey, we've taken the first steps in applying for the loan. Here's my lender letter that shows that we've gone through this process. If I need to have a conversation with the listing agent, then I'm talking to them about that.
So that's why you should put completed on the deadline.
Right.
Which can't
It can't be complete according to the definition of the CFPB. Application within our contract isn't defined, so again, it's kind of one of those gray areas, but I just err on the side of conservative and in process or submitted or something along those lines. New loan review. If buyers pay all or part of the purchase price with a new loan, this contract is conditional on the buyer determining in buyer's sole subjective discretion whether the new loan is satisfactory to buyer, including its availability, payments, interest rate, terms, conditions, and costs. This condition is for the sole benefit of buyer. Buyer has the right to terminate under 25.1 on or before the new loan termination deadline. So again, big things here is it is just for the benefit of the buyer, and it's in the buyer's sole subjective discretion on whether or not they like any of this stuff that's a part of the loan. Notice it says including, it doesn't limit it to that, right? It could be anything, but it's got to deal with the loan. There's a lot of agents that are out there and say, oh, don't worry about it. We can just terminate later on under the new loan termination deadline for any reason whatsoever. False. Any reason whatsoever tied to the loan, right? So as a listing agent, I get a new loan termination notice to terminate. I'm firing back to the buyer's agent saying, hey, what is it specifically with the loan that the buyer doesn't like? Yes, I get that they have the right to terminate under this thing, but I want something in writing from that buyer's agent to say it was the interest rate, or they didn't qualify, or they didn't something along those lines, so that in the event my seller decides to challenge the earnest money and go to court, that buyer's going to have to put their hand on the Bible and say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And it was, yes, it was the interest rate, or yes, it was this issue that caused us to terminate. That's why we got out of the contract. So I want that in writing saying this is the reason that they got out in the event that the person, I don't think we have much of a chance to challenge it, but the seller wanted to go after it, then they could. If seller is not in default and does not timely receive buyer's written notice to terminate, buyer's earnest money will not be refundable except as otherwise provided in this contract. So other areas where it grants them the ability to terminate, they can terminate, but they can't terminate based off a new loan if it's not something to do with the loan, right? And notice that it specifically says appraisal value or the lender requirements, right? Buyer can't go past those deadlines and then say, hey, we're canceling under new loan because we can't get the loan because of the appraised value. But no, we already had the chance to talk about that and negotiate against that under the appraisal deadlines or the lender requirements pieces, right? That was all covered under, or the conditional sale deadline, right? Hey, we can't get the new loan because we didn't sell our house, but we went past our conditional sale deadline. That's already a part of the contract. You can't use this new loan termination for something that's already got dates and deadlines. It's part of the contract, right? Credit information, again, advanced contract sort of a thing. More for seller financing, they can get, credit stuff of the buyer, determine whether or not they want to actually extend that loan. Existing loan review is an advanced piece. That's about the assumption. Buyer has the right to get the terms of the existing loan and make sure they're comfortable with them. Appraisals. Okay. An appraisal is an opinion of value prepared by a licensed or certified appraiser engaged on behalf of the buyer or buyer's lender to determine the buyer's property's market value, or defined term appraised value. Appraisal may also set forth certain lender requirements, replacement, removals, or repair necessary on or to the property as a condition to the property to be valued at the appraised value. That's a lot. So it's just defining that and saying, hey, there may be some issues that come up on the appraisal. They're going to have to be addressed in order for that appraised value to stick, or for the lender to say, hey, we can give you this money. If it's a conventional loan, this is what it's talking about here. Buyer, here's another potential gotcha in the contract, right? The appraisal deadline, I don't know why we actually had it, right? Because look at this. If the appraisal is not received by buyer on or before the appraisal deadline, buyer may, on or before the appraisal objection deadline, terminate. So, hey, we're going to try and get the appraisal by this date, but if I don't have it by the objection deadline as a buyer, I can just terminate and get out of the contract. So why we have the appraisal deadline, I don't know, but just know that just because it's there, buyer still has the right to get out up until the appraisal objection deadline expires. So if there's a value issue, so purchase price $500,000, the appraisal comes in at $480,000. The options for the buyer in the conventional are to terminate, just punch out and say it's done, or to deliver an appraisal objection, saying, hey, here's our appraisal objection. There's an official form that you need to fill out. And one of the requirements as a part of that appraisal objection is either to send a copy of the appraisal or a letter from the lender stating what the actual appraised value was according to that appraisal. So you can't just say, hey, it came in under value, we need to renegotiate. You got to deliver the actual form. Reserve the right underneath the appraisal objection deadline that's above. And then if resolution is not met by the appraisal resolution, you got an automatic termination clause. Okay? FHA and VA appraisals. So they act similar in the event that if the appraised value comes in for less than the purchase price, seller does not have the right to keep earnest money, regardless of when it is delivered, when that appraisal is delivered, and regardless of the dates and deadlines that were identified above. The government says, hey, we're a government entity. We may or may not be able to meet your dates and deadlines, right? And so we're just going to exempt our borrowers from having any potential loss of earnest money based off of our failure to be able to get you an appraisal in a timely manner. Right? So that's what those two sections. This is a potential area I see can get caught up sometimes too. So you're working with an FHA buyer, they're wanting to write on a house that's $350,000, so you got a purchase price of $350,000, you put in $350,000 in this one. Seller counters you and says, hey, we got other offers. We got a $360,000 purchase price, right? So they send over a counter proposal. It says purchase price to be $360,000, but you say here it's not less than $350,000. Right, so if the appraisal comes in at $355,000, your FHA buyer may be automatically into an appraisal gap guarantee unintentionally, right? So just know that if you get a counter that's higher than your FHA purchase price, make sure you go back and amend 6.22 as well to say, you know, hey, if we're pushing price to $360,000, we need this to be $360,000 as well. Does that make sense? You guys kind of following that? Yeah. That section.
Does that count for VA too?
VA doesn't have this section that says, it's, right. So VA just says whatever the purchase price is the purchase price. And if the appraisal comes in for less and you guys aren't able to come to an agreement otherwise, you don't have the right to keep the buyer here. But it's got to be on the appraised value in FHA or VA, not like you can't go past the new loan termination deadline, find out that they don't qualify, and then try and invoke this clause. That's not going to work. This is just in regards to the appraisal portion.
Okay, so do you even need to fill out the 6.2.2 if you have a VA loan, or you just put any?
622 is for FHA,
Right.
So VNA. Yeah, so you mark the box up above that said it's a VA financing, and then 623 kicks in here. Right? If it's conventional, neither of these paragraphs apply to the contract. Lender requirements. Okay, so if the lender imposes any written requirements, replacement, removals, or repair, including any specified in the appraisal, which is defined as lender requirements, to be made to the property, examples, roof repairs, repainting, beyond those matters already agreed to by seller in this contract terminates on the earlier of 3 days following seller's receipt of the lender requirements or closing unless prior to termination. So what this is saying is, hey, FHA appraiser comes out, he sees a health and safety issue, he puts it as a condition in the appraisal. Right? You turn that over to the seller and you say, hey, listen, this has got to be addressed because we can't get the loan without it. Many times what I see happens in this situation, the seller saying, wait a minute, they've already been through this. We've negotiated inspection items. You know, I'm done dealing with any of these pieces. I'm not going to deal with it anymore. What this says is you deliver to me as a listing agent an appraisal that says, hey, we got these lender requirements. A 3-day clock starts ticking automatically. And at the end of that 3 days, if we haven't come to an agreement out of one of these 3 things, and it's really 2, I'll talk to you about that in a minute, then the contract automatically terminates and it's gone. So unless prior to termination, the parties enter into a written agreement to satisfy the lender requirements. So they say, okay, listen, we'll go out, we'll take care of that peeling paint, right? Scrape it, we got some extra paint down below, that's not a problem, we can handle that. But if it's a major safety issue and the seller's saying, no, I'm not dealing with it, what is the options, right? The buyer may be able to go in and fix it, but the risk there for the buyer is what happens if the property doesn't close? Now they've done improvements to a house that they don't own, right? And they can't get their money back unless there's something agreeing, written in the agreement as a part of that. And the risk for the seller is, hey, listen, if they fall and hurt themselves while they're doing these repairs on your property, it's going to go against your homeowner's insurance claim, Mr. Seller. You have some liability from letting these people come onto your property and do this work. Are you okay with that? Seller may say no, right? They're not obligated to do so. So 2, the lender requirements have been completed. So example there would be inspection happens, notice the health and safety issue, we put it on the resolution, seller agreed to fix it. Sometime after, from when the seller or when the appraiser showed up to when we got the appraisal back, seller had a contractor come in and fix the issues already. So those things have already been completed. That nullifies this lender requirement piece. It's already been done. We don't have to worry about it. Or 3, the satisfaction of the lender requirements is waived in writing by buyer. That's a non-option option in my opinion. Lender's saying, hey, these things have to get fixed in order for us to appraise the value of this and for us to lend the money. Buyer says, no, just kidding, lender. I want your money, but you really don't want those things fixed. I don't know of any lenders that are going to listen to a buyer in that sort of situation. So option 3 is written into the contract, but I can't think of an actual situation where it would come into play, right? It's just a non-option option. So it's really those 2. And it's entered into the written agreement is where I see most of the things happen. But that 3-day notice is a big one. Prior to the contract change in 2019, you used to read that the seller had 3 days in which to terminate. And if they didn't terminate within that 3 days, then it was assumed that they were going to adjust those issues. So they just changed this. There's a lot of agents out there that don't understand that change. So be cautious and know that they may not understand that. Cost of the appraisal, this is pretty much self-explanatory. Who's paying for it? Typically, I see that associated with the buyer's cost. And if they need some help, it's usually addressed under seller concessions. Okay, throughout the contract to buy and sell, you'll notice sections that are big, bold, all caps. It's the real estate commission saying to the clients, hey, this is a potential issue. This is a big piece. Make sure you pay attention to this sort of stuff. This has just gone through a major change within this last contract update here as well. Not this section, but I'll talk to you about it in a minute. But hey, if a homeowners association applies, then know that it could be an issue. And so that's what they're basically saying within that big bold area. But commission wants to bring attention to it. Association documents to the buyer. So you got a deadline of when those documents are going to be delivered. Note here, seller is obligated to provide to buyer the association documents defined below, and we'll see that in a minute, at seller expense on or before the association documents deadline. So seller is the one that's responsible in order to deliver those to the buyer. So what does that look like? All of this. So it's not just the CIC, the covenants documents, and that's what a lot of the sellers are thinking. Hey, I'll just jump online, I can download a copy of that, I'll send it to you, you can turn around and send it to the buyers. Well, it's got to have the declarants, the articles of incorporations, the minutes, list of all associations' insurance policies. All of this stuff is what the seller is agreeing to provide to the buyer as a part of the association documents. If they don't deliver all of this stuff, then a buyer could consider it, you know, hey, you can give me all of this sort of thing, and gives them a big out all the way up until the day of closing. Most of the title companies have a service that will do it on the seller's behalf, but there's an additional charge for the seller. So make sure you're having a conversation with your sellers and just saying, hey, listen, you can go and get this stuff, just make sure you get everything that's listed here in section 7.3 in order to be in compliance. Or we can leverage that off, and I think it's like $150 or something along those lines. Have another company that'll do it. So title companies they're most often subcontracting that out to a company called Associations Online. Associations Online is very familiar with our contract, and so they're going through and making sure that everything's a part of that. If it's not a part of it, then they're having conversations with the HOA and saying, hey, you're out of compliance with your requirements. These are things that need to be done. And so it works out well. It's slick if you can get your sellers to.
Didn't the title companies just recently start charging like a small fee for that?
Not just. I mean, it's been around for a while.
Well, there's a fee associated with it, but then now, like, there's a separate fee.
There's always been the transfer fee and the status letter fees
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff that the HOA charges to transfer it over to the new buyer. But the title companies, I've always seen a charge. It's become more apparent with the changes in the contract when they were start spelling out specifically some of those things that were there.
Because I just, even like, so today I had a deal where land title next door, now they're charging $50 fee.
50
Yeah, $50.
to get
To get,
the HOA stuff.
yeah. It's not big.
And it may
Totally
be
worth it, but-
It may be that was a charge that the HOA charged them, and so they're just passing it along. So once the buyer has those association documents, it's conditional upon the buyer's review. They have the right to read through that sort of a piece and then terminate. So buyer has the right to review the association documents. Buyer has the right to terminate under 25.1 on or before the association documents termination deadline based on any unsatisfactory provision of the association documents in buyer's sole subjective discretion. So why isn't there an association objection deadline? We have an inspection objection, we have a title objection, we have an appraisal objection. There's no association objection. Why?
We can't change it.
Yeah, right? Within the terms of our contract, 30, 45 days, what is the likelihood that the seller is going to be able to get the HOA to change their bylaws, change a covenant or something along those lines? It's just slim to none that that's a possibility. So rather than throwing an objection deadline in there that the seller can't do anything about anyway, they said, okay, buyer, your options are to accept the HOA covenants as they are or to terminate. One or A or B, just make a choice. Right? Notice this too. This is another area that a lot of agents aren't aware of because they don't know their contracts inside and out. Should buyer receive the association documents after the association document deadline, buyer at buyer's option has the right to terminate. So you deliver the association documents documents after that deadline, or they just haven't even come by the deadline, buyer can terminate. Boom, they're out, moving on. Or they get 10 days extension for that termination deadline. So the buyer's option, buyer has the right to terminate by buyer's notice to terminate received by seller on or before 10 days after buyer's receipt of the association document. So typically what I'm seeing in my contracts, association documents are delivered Wednesday, termination deadline is Friday. 2-3 days maybe for the buyers to review the HOA docs and deadlines. 10 days is a substantial addition to that.
Just gives it more time to
Right.
go through.
And all of a sudden the buyer gets cold feet and they don't like something. Do you think they're going to find something that is objectionable in their sole subjective discretion within that CIC docs that aren't there? A lot of times you see agents that are panicking come the association doc. Oh, we got to get an amend extend on the buy side. If we don't have it, we got to do an amend extend. No, don't. As a buy side, your buyer is better protected and they're going to have more time to review it. It's 10 days after the receipt of those association document deadlines. So whenever they're delivered, and Buyer does not receive the association documents, or if buyer's notice to terminate would otherwise be required to be received by seller after closing date, buyer's notice to terminate must be received by seller on or before closing. So that means you show up, say association documents get delivered a week before. Buyer shows up, they can walk in to the closing, hand seller a notice to terminate right there at the closing table and say, hey, I'm out. Right? I know you think we're closing today, but I don't like the association documents. I got them a week ago. This provision gives me 10 days, up and 2 on or before closing. We're here before closing. Here's my notice to terminate. Right? So on the listing side, pay attention to your dates and deadlines. On the buy side, I typically don't raise anything if I don't get the association documents in time. After the deadline, maybe I'll reach out and say, hey, by the way, where's my association deadline and the documents coming? We're going to do them next then. No, we're going to leave it as it is. All right, so evidence of record title, seller selects title, buyer selects title. Who's selecting the title company? Whoever's selecting the title company is paying for the title, right? Is there a way to have buyer select, seller pay? Say yes.
Yes.
All rates, title insurance companies are regulated by the Division of Insurance. They have to file their rates on an annual basis. So sales price is $400,000. I can tell you what the title insurance costs are going to be for every single title company in the Denver metro area, just by a quick Google search going in. So I could do buyer selects and then ask for that amount of title insurance as a seller concession. Right? So if a buyer has a specific title company that they want to use, but they're not interested in paying the title, or I can put seller selects and then an additional provision. Seller agrees to select blank as the title company, according to 8.11. So there's ways. Just because it's written this way doesn't necessarily mean it's not. What about an abstract of title? You guys remember that from real estate school?
The list, right, of former.
Yeah, abstract of title is going to come from an attorney, basically, and the attorney is going to go in and do the research in terms of the chain of command and write up their abstract of title and say, this is what I believe the title to be, and be able to transfer it up. Where we're dealing with in the Denver metro area, you're not going to run into this thing. This is going to be more in the rural communities, way out sides, but it is a possibility. So we want to at least have the opportunity or the ability. Owner's extended coverage as a part of the title. There's 4 standard exceptions that the title companies always put on their title commitment. And they deal with parties in possession, unrecorded events, survey matters, and unrecorded mechanics, liens, gap periods, all that sort of stuff. So those are always just the standard exceptions you're going to see on any title commitment that comes out. And OEC says that there's an additional policy that's going to go on top of that are deleting, or at least attempting to delete, those standard exceptions. As a buyer's agent, you want to always check that the OEC will be a part of the title commitment. Just adds additional protection for the buyer in regards to that title insurance. And I usually check the seller to pay it. It's $75, so when we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in a real estate transaction, for $75 doesn't move the needle that much. I don't get much pushback on this stuff. Notice though here, and then we'll talk more about it in the advanced contracts class, but regardless of whether the contract requires OEC, the title insurance commitment may not provide OEC or delete or insure over any or all of the standard exceptions for the OEC. So just because it's saying, hey, we want OEC to cover unrecorded easements, there's a possibility that would get moved over to an exception of the contract rather than. Example I just had in my office, title commitment came back and said the ILC was required. And they needed it as a part of the title commitment, so they had it listed as a requirement. Contract was silent in regards to ILC, who was responsible for paying for it, who was going to order it, any of that sort of stuff. Seller didn't want to do it. Actually, seller wanted to move on to a backup contract that was behind it. We called up the title company. We said, hey, move that ILC from a requirement over to an exception. And the buyer's agent said, hey, well, it's not gonna have OEC, so therefore we file a title objection. I said, great. We just went silent on it, right? And then they finally read the contract and it says, oh, hey, by the way, we don't have to provide insurance over all of it. It may not do so, and it's already a part of the contract. So all of a sudden they remove their title objection, and we're moving on. Okay. Title documents. So documents consist of the following: the plats, copies, so on and so forth. Standard language kind of within here. Copies buyers must receive on or before the record title deadline. Copies of all that stuff. It typically comes out in an email. You'll get copied on it. They'll get copied on it. I don't go in there and I don't start advising on title insurance and exceptions and those sorts of things. But I will make sure they received it, bring it to their attention. If they've got questions, encourage them to seek counsel that are out there. If there's something that's glaring and says, hey, wait a minute, there's a potential issue here, I may point that out to them and say, you may want to talk to your attorney about this. So definitely read through it, check it out, see if there's anything that's a part of the commitment that's going to be awkward. Record title, so on or before the record of title objection, the buyer has the right to object on any unsatisfactory form or content of the title, commitment, or abstract of title, or other unsatisfactory title condition, and buyer's sole subjective discretion. We are a caveat emptor state, buyer beware sort of piece. So contracts are heavily favored towards the buyer. Buyer, here's your opportunities to do all your due diligence, to check out the property and make sure it's to your liking and everything that's part of that is good. If you don't like it, you got a lot of opportunities to get out of it. So be sure that the buyer is going through and checking out all this stuff because this is their opportunities to object by these deadlines. Same thing here though. If buyer hasn't received the title commitment on or before the title deadline, there's that 10-day piece, right? So they get 10 days from when it's actually delivered to get that record title objection. And then same options. They can terminate, they can object. If resolution is not met, if they've delivered an objection by the objection deadline, then the contract automatically terminates resolution. Off-record title. This is one I see get mixed up with due diligence a lot, and a lot of agents don't understand. This is seller's responsibility in this stuff. Seller must deliver to buyer on or before the off-record title deadline true copies of all existing surveys in seller's possession pertaining to the property and must disclose to buyer all easements, liens, or other title matters not shown by public records of which seller has actual knowledge. Excludes the new ILC or new survey. And buyer has the right to do their own inspection. But I see a lot of times in the due diligence sections, permits, surveys, liens, things along those lines. All of that is supposed to be covered underneath this off-record title deadline. And it's the seller's responsibility during this period to disclose that information. So if there are any known easements, liens, surveys that they have, here's where they need to deliver it by that deadline. It's not the title company that's doing off-record title work. It's the seller that needs to be doing this. And then similar sort of stuff, right? Off-record title objection, and then your title resolution deadline. Same deal, 10 days in that portion.
Should you get something from the seller then stating that there was none, or that they did in fact look and there's nothing?
So what I do is I just send my sellers an email. Hey seller, we've got this title deadline that's coming, this off-record title deadline that's coming up. We need to deliver to the buyer these things if you have them in your possession or have knowledge of them. Let me know if there's any. And then I'm looking out for my client. Just me asking for them or reminding them of that situation, I think is good enough. I don't need anything back from them. If there was an issue and they got sued later on, I could produce that email and say, oh, I asked for you, I reminded you about the deadline here. You were a party to this contract, you signed it, you were the one that agreed to these deadlines. I reminded you of them, what else am I supposed to do? I can't go in and come through your folders and dig through your drawers to dig this stuff out,
Okay. So what about on the buyer side? Are you looking for anything there if they don't?
On the buy side, I would say 99% of the time, you're not going to get anything in regards to that. Again, bold, capitalize. So special taxing districts. So now they're just saying, hey, there's a possibility that this property is in a special taxing district. Buyer, you need to be aware that, if there's an issue, then you got to get out sooner rather than later. With the contract change in 2019, a tax certificate is going to be coming with the title commitment. Now, so that's part of the requirement for the title commitment is the tax cert. And so if there's a special taxing district that's there or shown on that taxing or that tax certificate, and that's where the buyer has the right on or before the record title deadline to object or to terminate based off of the special tax. Okay. So we talked a lot about these. Again, title objection is going to have the same language in there. Buyer's sole subjective discretion grants the right to terminate to the buyer based off of anything that they don't like, or if resolution isn't met by the resolution deadline, assuming an objection was delivered by the deadline, contract automatically terminated. Better first refusal, we'll cover more in the advanced contract. A lot of people think of this improperly. A right of first refusal in Colorado is referring to a community, association, or neighborhood that says, hey, listen, if you want to sell, we as the community have the right to buy it first. So the seller and the listing agent should know if there is that sort of a piece. Right? So what that does is you just have a deadline within the contract that says, hey, seller, you need to take this to the people that own that first right and see if they want to exercise that first right. If you go past this deadline, then we're moving forward with the contract. But it's not, hey, we have a conditional sale, and the kick-out clause, as Damien has it in our contract, their clauses, a lot of people are getting confused with this first right of refusal. It's mixing up the verbiage, where this is a defined term or section within the contract. I always people, talk first right of refusal if there's an area. Again, I have yet to run across one in hundreds of transactions that we've done. So it's not all that prevalent, but it is a possibility. Bold caps, one again, on title advisory. Basically, this is for the buyers. Heads up. When we're talking real estate in the Denver metro area, we're talking surface rights. Most of the mineral rights, water, oil, all of that stuff has been stripped away long ago by the railroad companies and that sort of stuff. So when we're talking real estate and real property in Colorado, we're talking the surface rights and stuff. There may be some mineral rights that you come across on occasion here or there, but it's going to be fewer and farther between. Again, I would encourage the seller in a case like that to get an attorney, because I don't know what mineral rights are worth and how to value that. It's not my area of expertise and how to tie that into a contract. I'm going to look to an attorney to help me out. The consultant attorney, right there. New ILC, new survey, again, we'll get more advanced detail on this in the advanced class, but note here that we're checking either an ILC or a new survey. It's one or the other. You don't want to do both. Right? And the major difference between the two is one is cost and two is liability that the survey company is taking on. With an ILC, if something is wrong, missed, there's error on it, oversight, the party that ordered it, their only recourse is to go back against the company that provided that ILC for the cost of that ILC. $450, $500, something along those lines. Whereas a survey, they're saying this is true and accurate. So not only can the harmed party get the cost of the survey back, but if there was damages that can be proven or anything along those lines, that can also be covered underneath the survey. And so that's why there's a major difference in terms of the cost. The survey company carries a lot more liability on the survey side. Who's ordering it? and then who's paying for it. Notice in here too that the buyer, be on the next slide. Buyer, seller, and the issuer of the title are going to be certified on there, and then who else needs to be? I don't ever put myself on this. I don't care whether or not I'm certified. I'm not a party to the contract, so I would never be harmed in something along those lines. But buyer's attorney, seller's attorney, something along those lines would be appropriate to go on that line if you ever came across it. And then buyer's right to waive or change the new ILC or new survey selection. So just because you put that date and deadline in there doesn't mean that the buyer's obligated to do that, right? So you may want to put it in there just to reserve the right to have it done and object to it. But if all of a sudden the buyer says, you know what, never mind, I'm not so concerned about it after getting to the inspections and those sorts of things, or spending more time on there, I don't really care if that fence is, on my property line a little bit by a few inches. They're not obligated to move forward with that. And then similar verbiage in here, right? There's an issue that shows up on the ILC or the survey, buyer has the right to object by the objection deadline, or they can just flat out terminate. And then the resolution kicks in. If resolution hasn't been met by the resolution deadline, then the contract will automatically terminate. All right. Property disclosure, seller property disclosure. On or before the seller's property disclosure deadline, seller agrees to deliver to buyer the most current version of the applicable Colorado real estate seller's property disclosure completed by the seller. What happens if your exclusive right to sell listing contract states that the buyer or the seller is not going to be providing you with a seller property disclosure? Better make sure there's no date or deadline associated with this property disclosure deadline, right? Up in the dates of deadline. They're saying, hey, I don't have any information about it. I didn't live in the property. I never got anything along those lines. Then don't have a deadline by which they are obligated to deliver that seller property disclosure, right? So just make sure what that contract states. Disclosure of adverse material facts, subsequent disclosure in present condition. So this is a change that was just added at the beginning of this year as well, but seller must disclose to buyer any adverse material facts actually known by seller as of the date of this contract, period. So now let's go back to my previous question. What happens if your seller says they're not going to be providing a seller property disclosure? My response to them always is that's your right. You're not obligated to complete a seller property disclosure. However, you are going to be obligated to disclose any adverse material facts that you know in regards to this property, and it needs to be updated as of the date of this contract. So, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, how do you plan on delivering that adverse material fact to the buyer if you're not going to be completing this seller property? Same thing that I'll ask the listing agents on the other side that says, oh, it's an investment property. My client never lived in it, so we're not going to be completing a seller property disclosure. That's all well and good, but that does not alleviate you or your seller from the fact that they must disclose any adverse material fact. As an investor, as a landlord, should they know if there was a flooded basement or there was major issues with the house or there was damage or things like that? Yeah, they're going to have that knowledge, and just not completing the seller property disclosure doesn't get them a get out of jail free card. In fact, this is the means by which they can prove that they disclosed that and it was provided to the buyer. The other thing to notice by this sentence says, as of the date of this contract. So for me, I'm always getting, let's say I'm get my listing agreement signed a month in advance, I got work to do to get it ready. I'll give them the seller property disclosure at that time. Say, hey, start filling this thing out because we're going to need it pretty quickly once we go under contract. Right? Make sure that as they accept an offer, you send it back to them and you say, hey, is this still true and accurate? Anything happened to the property between the time you completed this and today's date? Because that seller property disclosure must be as of the date of the contract, must be up to date as of the date of the contract. Okay?
And the seller's property disclosure commitment is in the exclusive right to
sell.
To sell, right?
Yeah. So in there it says they will or will not be completing one of those. Yeah. But if they check will not, make sure you don't have a seller property disclosure deadline in your contract by itself. This goes on to state that seller agrees that disclosure of adverse material facts will be in writing. In the event seller discovers an adverse material fact after the date of this contract, the seller must timely disclose such adverse material fact to buyer. Buyer has the right to terminate based on seller's new discovery on the earlier of closing or 5 days after buyer's receipt of the new disclosure. So, property goes under contract. Seller goes out of town on vacation. Sprinkler line bust, floods the basement. They understand that the contract, they got to get that cleaned up and addressed, so they hire a mitigation company, come in and dry it out, get it cleaned up, all that sort of stuff. That would be considered an adverse material fact. Hey, we had an issue with the sprinkler system. Needed to let you know that this is what happened, this is the remedy that we took, you know, and provide that notice in writing to the buyer of what happened. Buyer can come back in or terminate to review the stuff that's there. Here's another one. Except as provided within this contract, buyer acknowledges that seller is conveying the property to buyer in an as-is condition, where is, and with all faults. So what I see out there a lot is buyer goes under contract, they feel like they're paying a premium for the property because of the, you know, the way that this Denver market has gone over the last few years. So they think it's their right and their ability to object and ask for renegotiation pieces on the inspection, right? Well, seller is, per this sentence right here, under no obligation to do any of those inspection items, right? So if the buyer is thinking, oh, well, hey, I'll pay a little bit higher, but I'll get it on inspection, you know, get my money's worth by asking for all these sorts of things, they're risking it because they're agreeing right now, property is being sold as is, whereas with all faults. So the seller doesn't have to do anything. It may be in their best interest to do so. And that's the conversation I'm having with sellers all the time is, hey, we got to burn the hand versus two in the bush. Right? We know what this person is offering in terms of a purchase price. We know what this person is asking for in regards to the inspection objection. We don't know any of that if we go back on the market and we lose this buyer. We don't know what the next buyer is going to offer us, and we don't know what they're going to ask for on inspection. So maybe we should negotiate these or some of these. Be willing to do any of these, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. But they're under no obligation to. Okay, inspection. Huge, wide hole for buyer to drive, to get out of the contract, right? Unless otherwise provided in this contract, buyer acting in good faith has the right to have inspections by one or more third parties, personally or both. All right, so let's stop there for a second. So have the right to inspections. They can have by one or more third parties, so they can hire sewer company, they can hire a home inspector, they can hire a structural engineer, they can hire a mitigation or asbestos company, mold company, any or all of those that they want to within this, they can hire. They can do it themselves. And they can just go and conduct the survey or the inspection themselves. They don't have to hire anybody, they can do it personally. And the inspection is going to be the property and the inclusions. Anything that's included in the property is getting inspected, and it's a buyer's expense. If the physical condition of the property, including but not limited to the roof, walls, structural integrity of the property, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, or other mechanical systems of the property, the physical condition of the inclusions, service to the property, utilities and communication systems, and components of the property, like the heating and plumbing. 4, any proposed or existing transportation project, road, street, or highway. Or 5, any other activity, odor, or noise, whether on or off the property, and its effect or expected effect on the property or its occupants is unsatisfactory, and buyer's sole subject to discretion. Buyer may object or terminate. So with the inspection piece, it's got to fall within one of those 5 areas that's there. But if you're talking about the property, anything that's in the property, the services to the property, the road transportations, odors, smells that may or may not currently be experienced, but the expectation of it affect moving forward. If the buyer doesn't like it, they can get out. It's got to be specific to the property or the surrounding area or projects in the area or odor that's coming to the buyer that they can get out. But it's not just a, hey, we changed our mind, we got to get out, right? It's got to have to be something with the inspection. So the inspection objection, they can terminate an inspection resolution portion. Okay. So those are all going to be your standard statements in there. Damage and liens and indemnity. Here, the buyer is stating, hey, listen, if any of these third parties or these contractors that I've hired to come in and do the inspections on the properties damage your property, I'm responsible. The buyer is responsible. Buyer is responsible for any of the work that is done by their contractors. They're agreeing not to allow their contractors to place any liens upon the property, so they're responsible for paying for it. And in the event that they do, something happens, the contractor sues or liens the property, seller can go and sue that contractor, pay it, and then the indemnity says, buyer, I can sue you, you're paying my court costs, you're paying everything that's part of it. So.
Yeah, I was on the listing side, and we had buyers come in and start pulling up carpet. Their contractor came in and started pulling up carpet, started sticking screwdrivers to the hole, or to the floors. It was
A mess.
Yeah, it was a problem.
Yeah.
So my son was not happy.
Right. Well, this clause right there protected the seller, right?
Yeah.
So they could have gotten that stuff fixed and addressed,
Yeah.
and the buyer would have been responsible for the payment on that. They didn't close. But yeah, I've had contractors cut holes in the drywall, or things along those lines too. Yeah. Insurability. So buyer has the right to review and object to the availability, terms and conditions, and of premium for the property insurance. So anything with the property insurance, insurability, if it's in a floodplain, the cost of the premium, insurability of the house. What I see here a lot is a lot of the times insurance companies will give the first year and then they'll send a homeowner's insurance inspector out to the property for their renewal in the second year. Things like wood shake roofs are going to be an issue. If there's tree limbs hanging over the roof a lot, that's going to be a problem. But if in the event that there's any issues with the insurability, then buyer has a right to terminate on or before the property insurance. Due diligence. This is a tough one for residential resale. Damien hates it, but all current leases, including any amendments. If there's a tenant in the property, I would probably be looking at that, especially if there's a tenant in the property that's going to stay in the property after closing. We're going to want to look at that sort of things. It's not too often. More often, you're going to see the investment contract to buy and sell come into play for a property like that. But if it is a single-family detached home, it may be easier just to use this contract to buy and sell and ask for all those current leases. Other documents and information. The big issue here, and the one that Damien has so much heartburn over, is that a lot of people will say prior inspections, manuals, things along those lines in seller's possession. Well, what's to prevent the seller from coming in and taking that information and chucking it in the trash and then signing the contract? Right? They don't. It's no longer in their possession if it's gone, right? So they wouldn't have to be obligated. Now maybe the buyer is thinking that they're going to get this information, and they don't end up getting it because it's no longer in the seller's possession. The other thing, it's kind of my own personal pet peeve, but don't ask for my manuals on the appliances. Right, we'll leave them for you in the house. You can write something in the additional provisions. It says seller agrees to leave all manuals for the inclusions in the property. But really, does your buyer want to look as part of the due diligence and want to read the manual on the microwave? Right? And if you end up terminating, I don't want to chase you to get my manuals back from my seller and the listing agent. So I see a lot of people copy and paste from contracts that they received on a listing or something along those lines. Just what are you asking for, and does it make sense on the side? We'll talk more about this later, but again, objection, terminate, all the same typical language in regards to the. Okay, conditional sale of property. So if they have a home to sell, you want to have a conditional sale deadline up above. Notice here it states this contract is conditioned upon the sale and closing of a certain property owned by buyer and commonly known as blank. That's where you put the property address in. So it's stating here that it's not just getting it under contract, but that it's closing. buyer would have the right and the ability to put that date prior to their closing, but they just need to know that if that conditional sale property doesn't close, they don't have the right to get out underneath a new loan termination. The earnest money is very much going to be hard at that point, and they may be risking their earnest money. Buyer has the right to terminate under 25.1, effective upon seller's receipt of notice to terminate on or before the conditional sale, if such property is not sold and closed by the deadline. The section is for the sole benefit of the buyer. The seller does not receive buyer's notice to terminate on or before the conditional sale. The buyer waives any right to terminate under the provision. So again, just make sure how, a lot of times for a lot of times I'll see that deadline prior to the actual closing of the thing. Buyer just needs to be aware if they're selling a house that it's going to be potential earnest. How you guys doing? You want a quick break?
Sure.
Let's take 10 minutes. We got 1:41, so we'll come back at 9 to 2.
Okay. Oh.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah. bud. Hey, how's it going? Good, how are you? Good. How's it going? You learning something?
Yeah.
Good.
It's a couple times.
Read the contract, read the contract, read the contract. That's just kind of the.
Yeah, and I keep reading it, come up with more questions and answers most
Yeah.
of the time. So having someone go through it is nice. And then I'll read it again and come up with more.
How's it going in there? Oh, it's all good. Yeah. 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 Ready? Should we get back into it?
Yes, sir.
All right. I did say 151, so we're a little early if you want some more time.
No, we're good.
One of the things here to note, I kind of mentioned it before, but Damien in the clause manual, you guys are familiar with the clause manual? No.
No.
So, Damien Cox is an attorney that represents the brokerage firm. He represents this one and then mine as well. He's got a clause manual that he's kind of put together that, you know, he calls it kind of a foundation of clauses that you can drop into additional provisions, into amend extends, into, you know, closing instructions, all of that kind of stuff, just some general ones. And he knows that he can't write a clause that's going to be specific to every transaction that's there, but it's kind of a framework. So use it, adjust it. It's just kind of more, as he'll tell you, as a thinking point to kind of get that brain going. But one of the clauses that he put in there for us is called a kick-out clause. So in a case where it's a conditional sale property, if you're representing the buyer, I'd try and probably just get the conditional sale property accepted as is. If the seller's having heartburn about that, you can put in a kick-out clause. The kickout clause just basically states that, hey, seller, you have the right to continue to actively market the property. And if you get an offer that is acceptable to you, you give me however many days or hours, 72, 48 hours, something along those lines, to either waive this conditional sale requirement or to terminate the contract that allows you to go on and talk to or go under contract with that next buyer that's there. So it's a nice tool to be able to get conditional sales accepted sometimes. My standard piece is I'll usually go in, try it with just the conditional sale deadline. If they start balking on me along those lines, I'll add the kickout clause to them, which will give them a little bit more comfort that's there. On the listing side, my experience is that when a property goes under contract, it's under contract, and people's showings drop off significantly. The MLS requirements state that we have to change it to under contract, but they do have a section where they have a kickout clause, so you can kind of qualify that under contract. I don't think many buyer's agents search for properties that have that under contract kickout clause portion of it. So if you have a buyer that doesn't have a conditional sale, you might want to look at adding that to their search criteria, because you may be able to kick somebody out of the first position contract and get them to slide into that portion. Okay?
Where can I get that template for
So what are you using for your contracts?
CTM?
It's loaded in there.
It is.
Currently, now when we move to DocuSign and all that stuff and the new movement, they haven't done that yet. And it may be a part of your Market Center intranet. That's where it is on mine. It's just a Word document that's there. But if you go into CTM, go into like section 30 of the additional provision. It's called the clause manual. But you'll see within clauses, if you like in additional provisions, you'll see clauses. You click on that, you can scroll down and you'll find CBS, which is contract to buy and sell, and it'll have something that's labeled there, the kickout clause, and then next to it it'll say D. Cox, meaning it was authored by Damian Cox. You can click on that, drop it into the piece, and go from there. Okay. Source of water. There's a story in Colorado Springs, I believe. It was a whole subdivision. People were buying houses in there, going through. They thought it was city water that they were connected to. It turned out it was just a big well that was feeding that community. The well dried up, and there was all kinds of issues, obviously, that came from that. So source of water is what came from that. It is required for the seller to deliver this to the buyer saying, hey, this is where our water is coming from. So, well, obviously, we're going to put that in there. Or wherever they're getting their water from. That's why it's part of the contract. Lead-based paint. Prior to 1978, it's going to be a requirement for the lead-based paint. Contract changed a little bit at the beginning of the year, where now the requirement is that the lead-based paint disclosure must be signed by the seller and the real estate licensees and delivered to the buyer on or before the lead-based paint disclosure deadline. So to make sure that, if you're a party, you're representing the buyer or the seller, you get your signature on there right away, because without that, there's substantial fines that the government could levy on us for not providing the lead-based paint. As a part of that, the lead-based paint assessment, buyer has the right to do a lead-based paint assessment should they choose to. So typically what I'm seeing is the lead-based paint disclosure is about on or before, it's on the same day as seller property disclosure is what I'm seeing. So, seller property disclosure, here's the adverse material facts, and here's what we know about the lead-based paint. If the buyer so chooses, then they can get an assessment and deal with it as a part of the inspection portion. They don't like it, they have the lead-based paint termination deadline. But also note in here, buyer may waive the failure to timely receive the lead-based paint disclosure, or buyer may exercise buyer's right to terminate by seller's receipt of buyer's notice to terminate on or before the lead-based paint termination deadline. So, lead-based paint disclosure deadline comes up, buyer doesn't have it, buyer can terminate. So long as they do it before the lead-based paint termination deadline. Or they may just waive it. You know what, I don't care. I'm not planning on licking the walls anyway, so I don't care if there's lead-based paint. Carbon monoxide alarms. Your exclusive right to sell listing contract actually states that the seller is going to install carbon monoxide alarms prior to offering the home for sale. It's Colorado law. But it's restated in here, if the property has a fuel-fired heater or appliance, a fireplace, or an attached garage, and one includes one or more rooms lawfully used for sleeping, requires knowledge of Colorado laws, requires the seller to ensure the property has an operational carbon monoxide alarm installed within 15 feet of the entrance to the bedrooms. Under no circumstances do you ever want to install a carbon monoxide alarm. You want to be generous and you want to help a seller out, you can purchase them and deliver them to them, but do not ever install them, even if it's a plug-in or a battery-operated one. Leave it in the box, don't touch it beyond delivering it to the property. Why? Colorado statute states that if there is a malfunction or an issue with that carbon monoxide alarm, seller and or the installer could be held liable. So you don't want that on your conscience, or you don't want to be paying for any of that stuff too. Meth disclosure. If seller knows that the meth was ever manufactured, processed, cooked, disposed of, or used in the storage of property, seller is required to disclose such fact. No disclosure is required, however, if the property was remediated in accordance with the state standards and other requirements are fulfilled pursuant to that section. So, they carved this out because meth is such a nasty issue that they made it its own disclosure. Would this fall as an adverse material fact? Absolutely. But with the caveat that says if it was mediated properly, if they hired a mediation company and it meets all of the standards of that section, they don't have to disclose it. I haven't had the privilege of dealing with a meth house to my knowledge yet. However, my position is even if it was mediated, if it met the standards along those lines, I would be encouraging the seller to disclose it anyway. To say, hey, it was a meth house, here's the actions that we took, here's the fact showing that it was up to state standards, and going along those lines. Why do I say that? Damien and I call it the bundt cake effect. You've ever seen Damien teach, whatever, this is what we talk about. The bundt cake effect is we all have that nosy neighbor in our area that knows everything about everything in every houses and what's going on, right? And so what's going to happen is after somebody moves in, that buyer moves into the house, they're going to come and knock on the door, and they're just like, oh, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Here's your bundt cake. You know, just wanted to say hi and welcome you. And by the way, I didn't think anybody was going to ever buy this meth house, right? And if the buyer didn't know about it, what's their next reaction going to be? Be pissed off. They're going to be calling their buyer's agent. They're going to be calling their attorney. They're going to be saying, I didn't know anything about this. How could you let me buy a meth house? You know, any of that sort of stuff. And can a buyer sue a seller for any reason? Yeah. So long as they have the money to hire an attorney and go out there, they can sue you for anything. I mean, we're in a litigious world, and so they can go after it. If they get sued, the seller gets sued, the seller's going to have to get their own attorney to defend it and go after it. And so how much is that going to cost them? What is that going to look like? So it's easier, in my opinion, just to disclose it, deal with it up front, but seller's not required if they've met the standards of their mediation. So, further, buyer acknowledges the buyer has the right to engage a certified hygienist or industrial hygienist to test whether the property has ever been used as meth lab. Buyer has the right to terminate on this 25.1 upon seller's receipt of buyer notice to terminate. So again, back to the whole buyer beware sort of a piece. Do your investigation. The hygienist would fall underneath the one or more third parties to do the investigation on the inspection portion of the piece. Closing. Seller and buyer will cooperate with the closing company to enable the closing company to prepare and deliver documents required for closing to buyer and seller that designees, so on and so forth. Just saying, hey, we're going to go through this. Colorado Real Estate Commission closings are or not executed with this contract. Most of the time, at this stage, when you're writing or drafting the contract, they are not going to be completed. Real Estate Commission regulations state that if we are going to be performing the closing, which our license allows us to do, then the closing instructions have to be completed at the time of the contract. I always do them shortly thereafter, just to get them done. There's a clause in Damien's clause manual that talks about in the event that the parties don't have competing claims against the earnest money, if there's no written release that's being executed, what happens to the earnest money? I always want to come back to my brokerage firm. Because you get that buyer that knows they defaulted, clearly defaulted underneath the contract, but just don't want to sign the earnest money release, giving it to the seller, even though they know that that's what it was entitled to. That clause in the closing instructions states that in the absence of competing claims, the earnest money would be released to the listing brokerage firm. And then I, as the employee broker, could make a determination, was it a clear default? If so, I have no problem handing that money over to the seller. But in absence of something along those lines, the money's just going to sit there. Real estate or the title company doesn't have to do anything with it. They can just sit on it. Closing means the delivery of deed from seller to buyer will be a closing. Closing will be on the date specified by the closing date or by mutual agreement at an earlier date. So it could happen prior to the closing date, just per the contract, it's not going to happen before. The hour of closing will be designated by, put somebody in here, one person. I don't care who it is. You want to trust the listing agent, you can do that. If you're the buyer's agent and you want control over it, do that. I usually put closing agent in there just because I want somebody to say, if we can't agree, I need somebody to say, this is the location and time that this property is going to close on this closing date, right? If it says by mutual agreement of the parties, what happens if the parties can't mutually agree? Who's in default?
Everyone.
Yeah, he's going to do one of these things, right? It's not me in default, I'm not in default, you're in default, you're until back and forth. So that's why I like one person to be there. Closing agent, their title company, they're going to try and appease all parties for what they can. But push comes to shove, I want somebody to say, this is the place and time this property is closing, be here or be in default. Disclosure of settlement costs, oh hey, by the way, there's cost to closing your house, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Transfer title, how is it going to be transferred? General warranty, bargain and sale, quick claim, personal representative, or some other type of a deed. This section has been reworded now with the change that came out in the mid-year. And it's not quite as bad anymore, but as a seller's agent, the special warranty deed is what limits your seller's exposure the most, right? The special warranty deed says, hey, I'm going to cover, as the seller, I'm going to cover any title claims against the title during the time that I was the owner of the property. If it's not covered under title insurance and I was the owner, then you can come after me, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer. The general warranty deed goes back for a long period of time, back to the conception of the property that's there. So there's some potential liability that the sellers are taking on, maybe unknowingly, by offering a general warranty or by transferring. Payments of liens and encumbrances. This is what I kind of was talking about before at the O&E. Unless agreed to by buyer in writing, any amounts owned on any liens or encumbrances securing a monetary sum, including but not limited to any governmental liens for special improvements installed as a date of the buyer's signature hereon, whether assessed or not on previous year's taxes, will be paid at or before closing by the seller from the proceeds of this transaction. So right here, the seller's agreeing to pay any and every lien that's against the property, regardless. So whether they know it's there or not, tough. If it's there, they're paying for it. That's why the seller needs to be aware. I do what I can to try and make it. Closing fees and association fees talked. Who's paying these costs, right? And that's where it's just kind of running through it. Closing service, that's the title company's cost. There's their fee for doing the work. I don't know, land title, I don't know what theirs are. I know First American's $380, whatever, they bundle it kind of together. Both parties are getting benefits from it, so I typically check half and half on that sort of a thing. Status letter, record change fee, that's in regards to the association, right? Who's paying for those sorts of pieces? They can get out of control. These HOAs are running wild, in my opinion. I've seen some ridiculous charges on these pieces. So most of the time I do see it associated with the seller, and it's a point of negotiation. So everything in here is negotiated. Status letter is this one, record change fee is here, local transfer tax. You don't have that too much down here in the metro area. I see these more in the resort areas, Winter Park, Vales, those sorts of pieces, that there's an additional cost to transfer the property. Just another way for the municipality to make some extra money. Private transfer fees, similar to the local transfer fees, but maybe there's something in regards to that specific township or community, something along those lines. If there's a water transfer fee, who's dealing with those pieces. And then the sales and use tax. Sales and use tax is you go in and you buy curtains, right? You're going to pay tax, sales tax, on the purchase of that. Well, this is technically part of the sales price, is including personal property, which could be taxed. Right? Currently not being taxed by any counties and municipalities that I'm aware of, doesn't necessarily mean that that may not change in the future. Right? So in the event that somebody does have a sales and use tax that's in place, who's responsible for paying for that? If it's in a multiple offer situation, maybe they can check it none. And then they can fight about it later. Or, if you're representing one side or the other, you think you can snake it through. In the event that they do come back and start trying to change it, sign it to the other side. Oops. FERPTA. So this is a nice change that they just installed at the beginning of this year into our contract, but in regards to foreign investors that own property in the U.S., there's potential capital gains that can be made on the properties, right? But if a foreign investor is not paying taxes within the U.S., how does Uncle Sam get their money? They want their money, huh? At closing, or they go after the people that they have jurisdiction over, and that could be the buyer. So prior to this insertion, which came in at the beginning of the year, it was up to the buyer's agents to do their investigation as best they could to see if FERPTA applied. And this could be substantial. It's 15% of the sales price that they want to collect as, tax that's there. So this now states that the seller is agreeing to cooperate with the title company to show whether or not they are a foreign investor and subject to this taxes. It also goes so far as to say if withholding is required, seller authorizes to withhold such amount from seller's proceeds. Seller should require a tax advisor to determine. Right, so right there, they're already giving the permission to the title company to withhold the potential taxes in the event that the title company feels that FERPTA is going to apply here.
And that's whether that box is checked.
Whether or not it is.
Okay.
I mean, if this box is checked in the section, seller represents that seller is, so there right off the bat, hey, FERPTA is going to apply. And if I'm working with the seller,
if you're on the buying side, and
you don't know, this covers it, right? Because it's saying here, the box in this section is not checked. Seller represents the seller is not a foreign person for the purpose of seller agrees to cooperate with buyer and closing company to provide any reasonably requested documents to verify seller's foreign person status, and then if withholding is required. So it still goes on to say, regardless of whether or not that box is checked, they're going to do their investigation, and should it be deemed that it does apply, they're giving the title company permission to do it, right? If I'm working with my seller and they are a foreign person, I'm encouraging them to talk to their tax accountant as soon as possible and provide some sort of a certificate or documentation to the title company that says, yeah, I know you want to withhold 15% of the sales price, but this is really the actual exposure that we're going to have, so it can be less than that amount, right? So it doesn't necessarily take all of that money out. And just because whether it's FERPTA or this Colorado withholding, as soon as they file their taxes, they have the right to get the refund back, right? They're just going to overestimate, withhold those taxes, and then as soon as the documentation is filed, if there's a refund due, it's like withholding on your paychecks. The Colorado withholding is just talking like if your seller is not a Colorado resident or not going to be a Colorado resident after closing, there could be some Colorado taxes that need to be withheld. It's typically about 2%, and so they'll withhold that. Send it over to the Colorado IRS as soon as the taxes are filed. Again, if there's a refund that's due, they can get that back. But that's just a warning to the seller. Prorations and assessments. So taxes, the personal property taxes, how are those going to be calculated? I see most recent mill levy checked all the time on these. So, rents, if there is a renter in there, how are the prorations going to be? The rent's actually received or accrued? If I'm representing a buyer, I want accrued. I don't care whether or not you're a good collector of your rents. If it's owed, it's owed. So I'm getting it from you whether or not you were able to collect it from the tenant or not. Association assessments. So it talks about the current assessments and what's happening that's there. If there's any special assessments assessed prior to the closing date by association, who's going to be obligated to that? So from the time of contract until closing, if the special assessment comes out, whose responsibility is that? Except, however, any special assessment by the association for improvements that have been installed as of the date of buyer signature hereon, whether assessed prior to or after closing, will be the obligation of seller. So, community gets hammered by hail. They go in, the association replaces the roofs that are on there. That happened prior to this contract being signed and accepted. Seller's still responsible for that special assessment for the roof since it was installed where the seller was the owner and prior to the contract being executed. If it happened after the contract was executed, then this sentence would apply. Seller represents there are no unpaid or regular special assessments against the property except the current assessments and blank, hopefully none. Other prorations, water, sewer, propane, interest on continuing loans, and blank. If there's any other costs that need to be prorated, when are those going to be? And then, unless agreed upon in writing, these prorations are final, meaning it's done. Buyer can't go back after your seller. Later on, seller can't come back later and say, oh, you underpaid me for my propane, so you owe me more money. Should be a final piece. Possession. So, when is possession going to be delivered? Right? If possession is going to be a day after closing, you're going to want to put a post-closing occupancy agreement in place, just to outline the requirements and stuff along those lines. You got this per diem sort of a thing here that says if failure to deliver, what's that cost going to be per day? I see some agents and the newer agents that get really excited about this. I'm going to hammer these sellers. We want $500 a day, something along those lines. $1,000 a day if you fail to deliver possession. Buyer's going to have to be put up in the hotel, and they've got storage costs for their furniture and this and that and the other. Okay, you know what? Seller, do you have any problems? You think you're not going to be able to deliver that? No? Okay, perfect. But no, as a listing agent, you come to me and say, hey, we need to extend closing by 3 days. I'm coming straight to this section right here and says, hey, you wanted to charge my seller $1,000 a day for failure to deliver possession. So you're asking for a 3-day extension on closing. So how are you planning on getting my seller at $3,000? I mean, I'll use this provision as a negotiation tool if you're coming back and asking for an extension of the closing date based off of your buyer being unable to perform. You're willing to charge my seller $300 a day for not being able to perform. Was your buyer willing to pay for not being able to perform to meet the closing date? So be cautious on that because you could be setting the parameters of a negotiation. Buyer represents that they'll occupy the property as a principal residence, or they do not. And then if this box is checked, buyer and seller agree to execute a post-closing occupancy agreement. Again, post-closing occupancy agreements you're going to want to get completed and sent over with the contract to buy and sell. Negotiate those at the same time. Even if you check this box, buyer and seller agree to execute a post-closing occupancy agreement, what happens if they can't come to terms later on? I had this happen, right? One of the agents in my office, there was a 2-week post-closing occupancy. This box was checked. Seller didn't want to pay any rent during that time. Buyer wanted to pay rent or some rent because it was a tenant that was in his property that was there. So we're 3 weeks into the agreement. Hey, wait, but you agreed to execute a post-closing occupancy agreement. Seller doesn't want to pay anything. Buyer wants to charge something per day. Who's in default of the contract? Going to be one of those things again, right? So what do you end up doing? How do you figure that out? There are some attorneys that are out there that I've heard talk on this subject that also state They could potentially argue this and just void the whole contract because the parties didn't come to a full meeting of the minds in regards to a full amount of the terms of the contract to buy and sell. And so since the post-closing occupancy agreement wasn't executed at the same time as the contract to buy and sell, there wasn't a meeting of the minds, and therefore there wasn't a fully ratified contract, and it just throws out everything else that's out there. So just do them together. If there's going to be a possession, send over the post-closing occupancy agreement and negotiate the two things at the same time. We'll talk about 31.1. That's the attachments section. Computation of days and periods. So a day, as used in this contract, the term day means the entire day ending at 11:59 United States Mountain Time Standard or daylight savings is applicable. So it goes to 11:59. If my resolution deadline is today, I got until 11:59 tonight to get that thing done. Unless there's something in the contract to buy and sell that adjusts that. I do have seen some contracts come across that say, hey, listen, I'm a family man, I'm just working a business. My business hours, I'm willing to work up until 8 o'clock at night, not wait until 11:59 at night. So there are some agents that are out there that have changed the definition of this day, change it to something a little bit more reasonable. If the parties agree to that, then we can change that. Computation of days. In computing a period of days, example, 3 days after MEC, when the ending date is not specified, so like 3 days after MEC, the first day is excluded and the last day is included. So if I have MEC plus 3 as my alternative deadline, Earnest Money deadline, contract is executed today. So today is mutual execution. Today is excluded. First day is excluded. And the last day is included. So then it would be Thursday, Friday, Saturday would be my alternative on Earnest Money deadline. Unless, if any dates or deadlines falls on Saturday, Sunday, or federal or Colorado state holiday, such deadline will or will not be extended to the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. Should neither box be checked, that they will not be extended. So I always put will, just because it's kind of a safety net, especially if you're doing MEC, say you're doing MEC plus 2, right? Contract is executed on Friday. That means Earnest Money is due on Sunday. How's that going to happen? Right? They can't deliver Earnest Money if the title company is closed. So will just automatically rolls that piece over. Okay? Causes of loss, again, advanced piece, but essentially here, as otherwise provided in this contract, the inclusions or both will be delivered in the condition existing as of the date of this contract, ordinary wear and tear accepted. So seller can't go through and start punching holes or damaging the property. If they do, they're responsible to get that stuff repaired outside of the inspection objection. They have to deal with it. Causes of loss and insurance. There was a time, a couple of years ago, May, out in Golden, we had this massive hailstorm that rolled through. I mean, shattered windows, windshields, sunroofs on cars, did a lot of damage to property. So how does that work in the event of contract, property's under contract, roof gets damaged, what's the piece? And this section talks about how that's going to be addressed. If it comes up, read through this. We're talking to the employing broker, but we're running out of time, so I don't have a lot of time to get into that. Damage inclusions, services, again, this is an advanced contract type of a piece, but if there's an issue with the services or utility lines, plumbing, heating, any of that kind of stuff, this section is what's going to rule. The property gets condemned. Buyer has the options to terminate. Go ahead and buy a condemned property, which I don't think they'd be interested in. Walkthrough. Buyer, upon reasonable notice, has the right to walk through the property prior to closing and verify the physical condition of the property inclusion complies with this contract. So right there, the buyer is given the right to do a final walkthrough. Sometimes it can get contentious with sellers packing up and on deal with that sort of stuff. I'm just going to have to possibly point out, hey, listen, this is granted to them as a I'd caution you, within Damien's clause manual, there's a section or a clause in there that talks about being able to do an additional walkthrough to verify the inspection items were completed and done properly. The big issue here is inspection resolution items were not completed. You do your final walkthrough the morning of closing. What happens? There's nothing in here, nothing in a contract, nothing in the inspection resolution that states the buyer has the right to terminate or to not close in the event that those inspection resolution items weren't completed. Well, if you find out about it 2 hours before closing, it makes it really difficult to negotiate or figure out something to do, right? Whereas if you put his clause in there, it talks about being able to go in and verify the inspection resolution items were done, maybe you can address that sooner rather than later. I would say at the very least, you're going to probably want to do the walkthrough a couple of days prior to closing if you don't use Damien's clause. Home warranty, just a notification of, hey, there's home warranties that are out there. We'll make you aware of them. Colorado is one of the states, one of the few states that doesn't have a high volume of home warranties being put on properties during the transit. So, recommendation of legal and tax counsel, again, just pointing out to the parties, buyer and seller, hey, this is a legal and binding contract. Make sure you seek the proper experts on that. Defaults. So time is of the essence for all dates and deadlines of this contract. This means that all dates and deadlines are strict and absolute. There's a date on there, that's the date. It's absolute. If any payment due, including earnest money, is not paid on or tendered when due, or if any obligation is not performed timely as provided in this contract or waived, the non-defaulting party has the following remedies. So if there's a default, if buyer is in default, what is seller's remedies? Most of the time you're going to be down here in liquidated damages. So seller may cancel this contract. All earnest money, whether or not paid by buyer, will be paid to seller and retained by seller. It is agreed that the earnest money specified in 4.1 is liquidated damages and not a penalty, which amount the parties agree is fair and reasonable, and except as provided in section 10.4, 22, 23, and 24, said payment of earnest money is seller's only remedy for buyer's failure to perform the obligation of this contract. Seller expressly waives the remedies of specific performance and additional damages. So earnest money is the only piece, is the standard contract, unless you're checking specific performance in case of buyer's default. Notice here too, and I see this happen a lot of people are interchanging the word cancel with terminate. But notice here where it says seller may cancel this contract. It doesn't say terminate this contract. Termination is defined in section 25, and we'll see that here in a second. But termination states that contract is over and buyer gets their earnest money back. So if we're using the term terminate, we're conveying that the buyer is getting their earnest money back, which may not be the case. In this event, if the buyer defaulted, saying that the earnest money is liquidated damages, and that goes to the seller, so we need to cancel the contract or wait for a default if it didn't close or something. Okay. If seller is in default, now the buyer may elect to treat this contract as canceled, so they have the same right. They can just, hey, seller, you're in default, I'm canceling this contract, in which case all earnest money received here under will be returned to buyer, and buyer may recover such damages as may be proper. Alternatively, buyer may elect to treat this contract as being in full force and effect. The buyer has the right to specific performance or damages or both. So they can force the seller to perform to the terms of this contract by going to court, and they can collect damages that are part of it. Now, which court hears the case is dependent upon the dollar amount of the lawsuit. Jurisdictional limits is $7,500 for small claims. So anything above and beyond jurisdictional, you're either in county or district court. The higher up the court chain you go, the further out it takes in order to get your case heard. So let's say you're going for specific performance because you're $400,000. You're going to be in district court. It takes you a year to get the initial court case heard. What happens with that buyer? Where are they staying for that year? That's all potential damages. Is there loss of appreciation during that year? That's potential damages. All of these things could be considered damages. And so not only is the seller potentially exposed to selling the house for that, but going to be covering all of those potential damages for the time that this buyer is. So that thing's got some teeth. It's a part of it. This adds to it. Legal fees, costs, and expenses is caused a shifting provision, right? Anything to the contrary herein, notwithstanding the event of any arbitration or litigation relating to this contract prior to or after the closing date, the arbitrator or court must award to the prevailing party all reasonable costs and expenses, including attorney's fees, legal fees, and expenses. So, talked about the buyer, right? Out for a year plus while they're waiting for the court to get heard. They got those damages, that sort of stuff. Now, this states that, by the way, seller, you could be responsible for paying my attorney and court costs and all that sort of stuff as well. The one thing I will warn you about here, even though this verbiage says court must award, my interaction and my knowledge about judges is they don't like being told what they have to do. So even though it states that they must do it here, is not a guarantee that they will. Okay. Mediation. So this is stating that if in the event of a mediation dispute, parties are agreeing to mediate before filing lawsuit. Provision states that it's got to be up for 30 days. You have to try and mediate for 30 days. And then once that 30 days is over, that's when they can start filing lawsuits. But nothing in the section prohibits either party from filing a lawsuit and recording a lis pendens affecting the property before or after the date of the written notice requesting mediation. The section will not alter any date in this contract unless otherwise agreed. Within the Damian Cox forms that he's provided to us, not the clauses, but the forms, there is a demand for mediation, depending on which side you're on. Demand for mediation, seller, demand for mediation, buyer. Fill that out, have your client sign it, send it over to the other party, and that's what starts that 30-day clock and ticking. Hey, we're not agreeing on this thing, we're demanding mediation. Typical thing is each party find a mediator or a list of mediators that they're comfortable with. They agree on one. Everybody's got to pay their half of the mediation costs. Sit down, hang out, chat about it for a while. Hopefully you can get something done, otherwise moving on to the courts. Earnest money dispute. So in the event that there's a dispute, seller says, hey buyer, you defaulted, I get your earnest money. Buyer says, no, I have the right to terminate. It's supposed to come back to me. This is what happens. It says, hey, here's what the earnest money holder, and it's sole subjective discretion, has several options. They can wait for any proceeding between the buyer and seller. So just say, hey, you guys work it out. We'll hang on to your money until you figure out and you tell us what it is. They can interplead all the parties and deposit earnest money into the court of competent jurisdiction. They say, you know what, we're done holding on to your money. We're turning this over to the courts. You guys go forward and fight it out with them. We're done with it. Right? Or provide notice to buyer and seller that unless earnest money receives a copy of the summons of complaint or claim containing the case number of the lawsuit within 120 days of the earnest money holder's notice to the parties, earnest money holder is authorized to return the earnest money to the buyer. So there's a lot of people out there that say that section says, oh, if my buyer just waits 120 days, it's going to get their earnest money back. No, it's 120 days from the notice of when that earnest money holder says, hey, if you guys don't do anything, I'm sending it back to the buyer. But how long is it going to take for the title company to do that? Most often, when I see title companies, they just Switzerland. They throw their hands up. Hey, we'll be here. You guys figure it out. Let us know. We'll be done. So that's why I like that clause in my closing instructions, so I can potentially step in and get that addressed. Termination. So here is where we have the definition of termination. The right to terminate. If a party has a right to terminate as provided in this contract, the termination is effective upon the other party's receipt of a written notice to terminate. The notice to terminate is just that, too, by the way. It's a notice. It only requires the party that is providing the notice to sign it. There's a big misunderstanding that both parties need to sign the notice to terminate. That's not true. Both parties need to sign the earnest money release, but not the notice to terminate. Provided such written notice was received on or before the applicable deadline specified in this contract. If the notice to terminate is not received on or before the specified deadline, the party with the right to terminate accepts the specified matter, documentation, or condition as satisfactory and waives the right to terminate. So every section where we heard that in buyer's sole subjective discretion, right to terminate, right to terminate, record title, appraisal, inspection, all of those sorts of pieces, they have the right to terminate up until the expiration of that deadline. After that, they're accepting the condition, the provisions, any of that. So now the effect of termination, in the event that this contract is terminated, all earnest money received hereunder will be returned to buyer, and the parties are relieved of all obligations here. So that's why I always caution people when they're talking about, hey, this party's in default, this contract's terminated. I don't know if you want to use the word terminated and default in the same section, because here's the effect of termination, is you're conveying that buyer's getting entire agreement. Everything within the terms of the agreement has to be contained within the four borders of the contract, right within the pages. Modification of the contract requires both parties to sign off on it. One party doesn't have the right to just arbitrarily start changing dates and deadlines or terms of the contract within there. Survival and succession. So successors, basically, I'm buying a property. My estate assumes the responsibility of completing this in the event of my death. Or sell. I'm under contract to buy. The estate is obligated to perform underneath the term. It may take a while for it to go through probate and get through all of that sort of stuff. Whether or not the buyer sticks around for that is another story, but the obligation does not pass with the owner or the buyer. Notice of delivery and choice. So any document or notice to buyer or seller must be in writing except as provided in 27.2 and is effective when physically received by such party and individual named in this contract to receive documents or notices for such party, broker or brokerage firm working with such party. So I receive a notice as a listing agent. It is deemed that my seller has already gotten that notice at the time I got it. Right? So that's when. Electronic notice as an alternative to physical delivery. Any notice may be delivered in electronic form to buyer or seller. And the individual named in the contract, broker or brokerage firm, at the electronic address of the recipients by fax, email, or none, or NA really should go in that blank. Still don't know. CTM usually comes by email, so I don't know, and Damien doesn't know what else should go into that. Electronic delivery of documents or notice may be delivered, one, email at the email address of the recipient, a link or access to a website or server provided. The recipient receives the information necessary to access the document. So HOA docs, usually come in like a link. Title commitments now with the secured servers and all that stuff are coming as a link. This clause allows that to happen. And then fax. It's been on forever since I received a fax. Choice of law. This is a fun one. This contract and all disputes arising hereunder are governed by and constituted in accordance with the laws in the state of Colorado that would be applicable to Colorado residents who sign a contract in Colorado for real property located in Colorado. So what does all of that mean? Basically what they're trying to do is you have a seller in Jersey and a buyer in California that's selling property here in Colorado. Regardless of where they signed the documents, it's all going to be here in Colorado. It's applicable to our laws. Okay. Acceptance. This proposal will expire unless accepted in writing by buyer and seller as evidenced by their signature below. The offering party received a notice of such acceptance pursuant to 27th on or before an acceptance deadline. If accepted, this document will become a contract between seller and buyer. A copy of the contract may be executed by each party separately, and when each party has executed a copy thereof, such copies taken together being forwarded. So that last sentence is counterparts. Right? Seller can sign a hard copy in one place, buyer can sign a hard copy in another place. You put those two together, and all of a sudden you have a ratified contract. Right? It doesn't have to be on the same contract in order for it. Note here too that The contract expiration is only in regards to how the contract is currently written, and if the seller or buyer wants to accept it exactly as it is. If a counter proposal is created, even though you're using parts of the contract to buy and sell, it's deemed to be considered a new contract. And so you put a counter proposal together after the acceptance deadline, it basically revives everything back up because now the seller or the buyer, whoever's receiving that counter proposal, has an option whether or not. They're not bound to do it. Does that make sense? You following me? A lot of people think, oh, hey, I got to give them a counter proposal prior to the expiration of this contract. That's not true. You have to get your seller to sign off on it prior to the expiration if they want to accept the contract as written. If they sign it after the fact, the buyer now has the right, they have to ratify the contract and say, hey, we're agreeing that we're willing to perform to this terms and conditions. Follow me on that piece? No? All right, so let's use an actual example. The acceptance deadline on the contract says tonight at 6 o'clock. I'm the listing agent. I take it to my sellers. They're like, yeah, I don't know. We want to think about it. We're going to sleep on it overnight. Right? They call me tomorrow, come back. They say, you know what, Keith, we didn't like the purchase price on this thing, so we want to put a counter proposal together. Okay, I put a counter proposal. I don't have to draft up a brand new contract, even though I'm doing tomorrow, and the acceptance deadline is 6 o'clock tonight. My seller tomorrow can say, you know what, I want to accept the contract as it was written, and we could sign it and then have to go back and put an amend or something together that stated that buyer and seller agree that the contract is in effect, and that would revive the contract. So, but if I do a counter proposal tomorrow, I send it over to the buyer's agent and they sign it, we have a fully executed and enforceable contract. Does that make sense now? Good faith, buyer and seller acknowledge that each party has an obligation to act in good faith, including but not limited to exercising the rights and obligations set forth in the provisions of financing conditions, title insurance, record title, off record title, new ILC, blah, 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 right? So this is a very broad, gray provision. And there's not a whole lot of case law that's out there that can say this is good faith and this is bad faith, right? It is determined on a case-by-case basis and would be only really determined by Your Honor, long flowing black road. So it gets thrown out a lot out there. Oh, this is bad faith or this, that, or the other. Reality is nobody really knows what good and bad faith is until it goes through the process and is heard by it. Additional provisions, the big thing here is number them, right? If you're gonna have multiple ones, so 30.1, here's my additional provisions. 30.2, here's my additional provisions. This allows it a lot easier to counter specific if I'm the listing agent, okay, I don't mind 30.1, we're gonna adjust 30.2, but it's a lot clearer to be able to counter the language rather than having you just list them individually, have to copy and paste and then rewrite it, and then, so to say 30.2 shall be adjusted to, or something along those lines. It's just good contracting skills, follow the provisions of the other contracts. If you look at the other sections, 30.1.1, it's all kind of goes down underneath. So just follow those. With your provisions, if you're not going to use one of Damien's clauses, you're drafting up one of your own. The big pieces to remember is as Damien would tell you, to run it to ground. Whereas the Real Estate Commission talks about is the ABCs. What is the provision about? Is your A. By when must it be completed? Is the B. And the C is what is the consequence of it if it's not completed, right? Those are all three aspects that you should have as a part of your provisions, right? Vague provisions get us back into that the attorneys win sort of a thing, right? As an example, buyer agrees to pay $5,000 above appraised value. What issues do you see with that?
Well, I've recently seen not to exceed.
Okay, so not to exceed,
Yeah.
the purchase price or something along those lines,
Yeah.
right? But the vagueness of that one is just that, right? If my purchase price is $350 and my appraisal comes in at $355 or $350,
When,
right? So yeah, the appraisal guarantee is not to exceed, or if I'm a seller, I may want to know if there's provisions in there that they're agreeing to lower the price automatically. But I don't, as a seller or as a listing agent, I want to know what the minimum number is that I'm agreeing to. If I get a lowball appraisal, that's a problem. So, in the event that the appraisal comes in for less than purchase price, buyer agrees to bring up to $5,000 to the closing table, not to total purchase price, not to exceed, $350 or something along those lines, right? So it's a little bit more specific, covering the contingencies that are a part of it. This contract is a backup contract. What does that mean? It's just, okay, but what do the dates and deadlines sections say? Does the buyer have to do the inspection, get an appraisal, do all that sort of stuff in a backup? Or in your clause manual, you're going to have backup verbiage, and you got TFC, right, which means termination of first contract. So now you can put everything as TFC. TFC +3 for alternative earnest money deadline. TFC +10 for record title deadline. TFC +12 for objection. And now all of a sudden, as a buyer, you're not obligated to start spending money on a property that you may not even have an opportunity to purchase because the buyer in position one gets it done, right? So provisions are an area that can be tricky. But again, use the clause manual. He knows that you're going to probably adjust it specific to your piece. He's using it as a piece. Put in only provisions that are required for that specific transaction. That's a real estate commission regulation, right? It's got to be specific to that. If you're using a boilerplate one that's always in your contracts to buy and sell, you could be found in violation. And then run it to ground. We talked about that. Attachments. Post-closing occupancy agreement is got to be an attachment. It's there. Personal property agreement is probably going to be an attachment if you have one of those. It's a party to it. Documents have been provided but are not a part of the contract. I don't know. I guess. So the property disclosure, if it's listed in the supplement section of the MLS, it's kind of a strange area that don't see a whole lot of information being populated in that. Here's your broker acknowledgments. To be completed by a broker working with the buyer, does or does not acknowledge earnest money receipt. Here, they broke this out at the beginning of the year. Although the broker is not a party to the contract, we are agreeing to cooperate upon request with any mediation request. So if our client goes to mediation and they ask us to help them, we are required to provide that as part of this. How are we working with the client? As a buyer's agent, as a transaction broker. Then we've got this box here that says it's a change of status. Rules are being changed at the beginning of the next year that state even if you check this box, that is not sufficient notice to the client to notify them of the official change of status. You're going to have to provide them with that separate document that's out there that says it's a change of status. How the commissions are being paid. Transparency, again, so they added this at the beginning of the year, brokerage firm name, license number, all that sort of stuff. If there's a complaint, they want the parties to easily be able to find the brokerage firm. Very similar on the seller side, right? So this is just the seller's broker's information. We're done.
sweet.
Questions?
So I have CTM
Uh-huh.
pulled up. Is it